In the dim corridors of Gothic imagination, there is a figure whose shadow has stretched farther than almost any other in the history of horror. The name alone is enough to conjure images of moonlit castles, the flapping of wings, and a presence that seems to linger just out of sight. But before we can peel back the layers of myth, before we can trace him through history, folklore, and fiction, we must stand at the threshold where so many readers first encountered him. It is late in the 19th century, and a young English solicitor named Jonathan Harker has just crossed into a land that feels at once real and impossibly strange. He has travelled by train, by carriage, and finally by a coach, driven at an unnerving pace through a night where wolves howl in the forests and peasants cross themselves at the mention of his destination. The journey itself is a warning, but Harker does not heed it. He is rational, modern, and English. He is stepping into an arrangement of business, not legend. Yet as the last horses strain against the dark climb to a crumbling fortress perched high above the Carpathian valleys, the stage is set for one of the most unforgettable introductions in literature. When the doors of that castle open, what greets him is not simply a man. The description is etched into memory. Tall, pale, dressed in black, with a moustache and a piercing gaze. The figure that extends a cold hand of welcome calls himself Count Dracula. The moment is quiet, almost courteous, but beneath it lies an undercurrent of menace. Stoker does not reveal the monster immediately. Instead, he allows the unease to grow in small details, the strangeness of his host's nocturnal habits, the peculiar absence of servants, the way Harker never sees the Count eat or drink. The castle itself reinforces the impression. It is vast, ancient, and isolated, a labyrinth of locked doors and shadowed corridors. It is a place cut off from the ordinary world, where time feels suspended. The longer Harker stays, the more the unsettling truth emerges. He is not a guest, but a prisoner, and the master of this castle is not merely eccentric, but something far older and more dangerous. This is where Dracula enters our collective imagination, not in a flurry of violence, but in a slow tightening of dread. He is courteous, but controlling, fascinated by England, but disdainful of its people, and always circling closer to revealing his true nature. The novel opens not with the terror of the hunt, but with the quiet horror of entrapment, of being in the presence of something that obeys different laws than the rest of the world. In this first meeting, we already glimpse the outlines of what Dracula represents. He is the foreigner who arrives from the margins of Europe. He is the aristocrat clinging to old power in a modernizing age. He is a predator cloaked in civility. And most of all, he is a figure of boundaries crossed between life and death, between man and beast, between history and myth. The detail of the castle gate is significant because it is both a literal and symbolic threshold. To cross it is to leave behind the familiar order of Victorian England and enter a realm governed by older fears. Stoker carefully prepares this transition. The peasants who warn Harker, the crucifixes pressed into his hands, the howling wolves, the eerie blue flames said to mark hidden treasure in the woods. All these details belong to a landscape where folklore is not quaint superstition, but lived reality. For the villagers, Dracula is not a literary villain. He is a force that shapes their world, a danger spoken of in hushed voices, something powerful enough that even strangers must be warned away. When Harker ignores their warnings, he is enacting the very hubris that drives so many Gothic narratives. The belief that reason and progress can withstand the weight of older, darker truths. The novel's first chapters linger in this liminal space for a reason. They establish Dracula not simply as an individual character, but as the embodiment of a place and a tradition. He is inseparable from Transylvania, a region whose very name means the land beyond the forest. To the Victorian imagination, this was a frontier, a borderland at the edge of the known world, where empires met and histories clashed. It was a place of deep forests, remote villages, and mountains that seemed to conceal secrets in their shadows. To set Dracula's home here was to root him in a landscape already associated with mystery, danger, and otherness. The castle itself becomes a symbol of this liminality. It is ancient yet decaying, formidable yet hollow, a remnant of feudal power standing against the tide of modernity. The figure of Dracula is introduced with this landscape in mind. He is not a random invention, but a distillation of centuries of stories, fears, and cultural tensions. The vampire as a concept already existed long before Stoker. Eastern European folklore teemed with tales of revenants, strigoi, and Noseratu, creatures that returned from the grave to feed on the living. Some were bloated and ruddy, more like corpses animated by hunger than elegant nobles. Others were spirits that sapped vitality rather than blood. What Stoker did was fuse these folk traditions with the Gothic literary imagination and give them a singular, unforgettable face. In doing so, he created a figure who felt both timeless and new. Dracula's first impression matters because it sets the tone for everything that follows. He is not introduced in the bustling streets of London or in the company of other characters. He emerges alone, in his own domain, at the edge of Europe, as a figure both host and captor. The sense of isolation and entrapment is key. Unlike later cinematic versions that often rush to show his powers, the novel allows dread to seep in slowly. Harker begins by rationalizing, but each detail chips away at his certainty until the realization is inescapable. He is in the presence of a predator. The way Dracula crawls down the castle wall like a lizard, the sight of him in his coffin, the wolves that seem to obey his command, each moment peels back another layer of the disguise. This introduction also lays out one of the central dynamics of the story, the interplay between modern rationality and ancient superstition. Harker embodies the professional middle class of late Victorian England, trained in law, commerce, and order. Dracula embodies the opposite: feudal power, folklore, and primal hunger. Their meeting is not just a Gothic encounter, but a symbolic clash of eras. The 19th century was a time of rapid change, industrialization, urbanization, advances in science and medicine. Yet it was also a time when anxieties about degeneration, contagion, and the fragility of civilization were pervasive. Dracula crystallizes these anxieties into a single figure. He is both alluring and repulsive, rational in speech but irrational in nature, aristocratic in bearing but bestial in appetite. As the first chapters unfold, we see Harker's initial composure give way to mounting terror. The locked doors, the mirror that mysteriously disappears, the discovery that Dracula casts no reflection, each moment strips away the illusion of safety. The castle becomes not just a setting, but a trap, a place designed to contain and disorient. Dracula himself appears at irregular intervals, sometimes absent for days, sometimes suddenly present, always reminding Harker that he is never truly alone. This rhythm of presence and absence builds tension, creating the sense that the Count is both omnipresent and unpredictable. The effect is claustrophobic. By the time Harker realizes the full danger, it is too late. He is already ensnared. What makes this opening so effective and why it still resonates is its careful balance of familiarity and strangeness. The castle is recognizable as a home, but it is also alien, shifting, and hostile. Dracula is polite, even charming, but his hospitality masks a predatory intent. The landscape outside is beautiful, but it is filled with wolves and uncanny lights. Stoker taps into the uncanny by taking the familiar and making it unsettling. This is not the horror of sudden violence, but the horror of realizing that something fundamental is wrong, that the rules of reality no longer apply in the way one expects. Dracula's first appearance is therefore not just a narrative device, but a thematic key. It tells us that this is a story about boundaries crossed and the dangers that lurk when those boundaries are ignored. It is about the price of underestimating the old world, of believing that progress has erased the need for superstition. It is about the allure of power and the cost of proximity to it. And most of all, it is about the shadow that lingers just beyond the edge of reason, waiting for the moment when the gate opens and the unwary step inside. From this threshold, the story of Dracula expands outward. Harker's ordeal is only the beginning. The Count will soon travel beyond his castle walls, crossing the border into England, bringing with him the fears of contagion, invasion, and corruption that haunted the Victorian imagination. But before he can invade the modern world, we must understand him in his original context, as a figure rooted in the soil and legends of Eastern Europe. To do that, we must look more closely at the land beyond the forest, the stage on which Dracula first emerged, and the cultural landscape that gave him life. To understand the presence that emerged from the castle walls, it is necessary to turn to the land itself. For Dracula is not simply a character imposed upon Transylvania. He is inseparable from it. The very name of this region, lying in the heart of present-day Romania, means the land beyond the forest. To the English reader of the late 19th century, this phrase conjured images of a remote and untouched wilderness, a place on the very margins of Europe, where the known gave way to the unknown and where the superstitious imagination could still find fertile ground. It was not a coincidence that Bram Stoker chose this location for his vampire lord. The landscape was not just a backdrop, it was a participant in the story. Transylvania at the time of Stoker's writing was already burdened with centuries of perception as a mysterious and dangerous borderland. It was a crossroads of empires, contested by Hungarians, Austrians, Ottomans, and local Romanian principalities. Its people were a patchwork of ethnic groups: Romanians, Hungarians, Saxons, Secules, each with their own languages, traditions, and beliefs. To the Western imagination, such diversity often appeared as confusion, as an unruly mixture that defied easy categorization. To Stoker, it was fertile ground for mystery, a land where layers of history and superstition clung to every valley. The isolation of its mountain villages, the persistence of folk rituals, and the presence of forests that seemed endless, all fed into the idea of a place where the modern world had not yet penetrated fully. For Victorian readers, the very word Transylvania carried an aura of strangeness. They would not have known much about its daily realities, but travelogues and popular accounts painted it as a land of wolves, craggy mountains, and peasants who still believed in ancient spirits. Emily Gerard, a Scottish writer whose essays on Transylvanian folklore were widely read in the 1880s, provided Stoker with much of his raw material. She wrote of the Strigoi, the restless dead who rose from their graves to plague the living, and of superstitions surrounding garlic, crucifixes, and holy water. These details, filtered through Stoker's imagination, became the very fabric of Dracula's world. When his readers encountered Jonathan Harker's journey into the Carpathians, They were stepping into a land that already had a reputation for being a stronghold of the uncanny. The landscape itself was crucial to this impression. The Carpathian Mountains cut across Transylvania in sweeping arcs, their peaks often shrouded in mist. Dense forests covered their slopes, creating an environment where visibility was limited, where paths could disappear, and where the line between safety and peril was always uncertain. Travelers spoke of the uncanny silence of these woods, broken only by the howl of wolves or the creak of branches. To walk into them was to step into a place where human presence seemed temporary and fragile. The forests were not just natural settings, they were symbolic barriers, separating the known from the unknown, civilization from wilderness, and life from death. The rivers and valleys added to this sense of liminality. Villages clung to riverbanks, their wooden houses topped with steep, shingled roofs, while church spires rose above them as if to ward off the encroaching darkness. Cemeteries were never far away, often placed on the edges of settlements, where crosses leaned under the weight of age and where folk traditions blurred the boundary between honoring the dead and fearing their return. In such a landscape, the vampire was not a foreign concept. He was a natural extension of a worldview in which the dead and the living shared close quarters, in which stories of revenants were not confined to myth, but treated as matters of caution. To the Victorians, steeped in industrial progress and urban growth, such a place was the embodiment of the past surviving in the present. The train might carry Jonathan Harker across Europe, but it could not erase the sense that he was travelling backward in time. Each stop took him farther from modern cities and deeper into a world where folklore and ritual retained their grip. The innkeepers who pressed crucifixes into his hand, the peasants who whispered warnings, the horses that balked at certain crossroads, these were not simply colourful details, they were signals that he was crossing into a land where the supernatural was not dismissed, but acknowledged. Stoker amplifies this by describing the transition in sensory terms: the cold air of the mountains, the unfamiliar foods, the sounds of howling wolves, the sight of villagers making protective signs. The land itself seemed to be preparing Harker for the figure he was about to meet. It is important to understand that Transylvania in Stoker's novel is both a real geography and a symbolic landscape. On one level, it anchors Dracula in a recognizable location, lending authenticity to the narrative. On another, it functions as the archetypal frontier, the threshold between the known and the unknown. The mountains are not just mountains. They are barriers that keep something ancient contained. The forests are not just forests. They are places where the rational order of England cannot reach. The castle is not just a ruin. It is a gateway to a different kind of existence. To set the vampire here was to give him the weight of place, to make him not merely an individual, but a manifestation of an entire landscape's reputation. Stoker was not inventing this from nothing. Reports of vampirism from Eastern Europe had circulated in Western Europe for centuries. In the early 18th century, Austrian officials stationed in Serbia and Wallachia recorded cases of alleged vampires, complete with exhumations and rituals meant to prevent the dead from rising. These accounts spread widely, fueling debates among scholars and clergy about the nature of the phenomenon. By the 19th century, such reports had declined, but the association of Eastern Europe with vampirism remained strong. Transylvania, with its remoteness and its tapestry of folklore, became the perfect shorthand for these associations. To locate Dracula, there was to draw upon a reservoir of cultural assumptions already in place. The idea of Transylvania as a character in its own right is reinforced by the way it contrasts with England in the novel. When Dracula later arrives in London, he is out of place. an intruder in a world of bustling streets, gas lamps, and modern medicine. But in his homeland, he is inseparable from the landscape. The wolves obey him, the mists cloak him, the peasants fear him. He is not a foreign invader there. He is a natural extension of the environment. The land beyond the forest is not just where he lives, it is what sustains him. His power is drawn from its soil, from its myths, and from the isolation that shields him from outside interference. This connection between the vampire and his land is also reflected in the imagery of soil. One of the most memorable details of the novel is Dracula's reliance on boxes of earth transported from his homeland. He cannot rest in foreign soil. He must carry Transylvania with him. This is more than a narrative convenience. It symbolizes the idea that his identity is rooted in his land, that he cannot be separated from it without weakening. Even in London, beneath the streets of the modern city, he lies in coffins filled with the earth of Transylvania, as if to remind us that his true strength comes from the land beyond the forest. By treating Transylvania as a character, Stoker was also tapping into deeper cultural anxieties. To his readers, the East was often imagined as a place of danger, corruption, and backwardness. It was a land that threatened to seep into the modern West, undermining its progress. Dracula's journey from Transylvania to England can be read as a metaphor for these fears, a symbol of invasion and contamination. The fact that he comes from a land imagined as both exotic and threatening was essential to his impact. He was not just a monster, he was a monster with an address, and that address carried with it centuries of associations. Yet within this portrayal lies a paradox. The very things that made Transylvania appear frightening to Victorian readers, the persistence of folk beliefs, the isolation of its villages, the dominance of its natural landscape, are precisely what make it fascinating today. The forests, the castles, the mist-shrouded mountains continue to draw the imagination. Modern visitors seek out Bran Castle, often marketed as Dracula's home, not because it is historically accurate, but because the landscape itself has become inseparable from the myth. Transylvania has become a brand, a shorthand for the Gothic, the uncanny, and the supernatural. Stoker's novel did not invent this association, but it amplified it to such a degree that the region will forever be linked with the vampire lord. In the end, the land beyond the forest serves as more than a backdrop. It is a mirror of Dracula himself, ancient, mysterious, layered with history, and resistant to the encroachments of modernity. To understand him, one must understand the place that shaped him, a land where the boundary between life and death, reality and legend, is porous. As Harker's carriage rattled through its valleys, as the wolves howled in the distance, and as the castle loomed above, Transylvania was not just scenery. It was a presence, a force, a character whose essence seeped into every stone of Dracula's fortress. And it is from this soil, both literal and symbolic, that the vampire rises to stride into the modern world. From here, the question becomes how this figure, so deeply rooted in place and legend, came to take on the face of a real historical man. For behind the fictional count lurks the memory of Vlad the Impaler, a prince whose brutality and reputation for bloodshed made him an ideal candidate for transformation into a monster of legend. Before we can fully grasp how Stoker's vampire became such an enduring icon, we need to step back from the castle walls and the mist-covered mountains and consider the stories that were already whispering through the villages long before Dracula was given his aristocratic title. Vampires did not begin with him, nor with Stoker's pen. They rose from the soil of Eastern Europe, fed by centuries of folklore, by rituals of burial, and by the unyielding fear that the dead might not stay in their graves. These older stories were not refined tales for novels or theatres. They were local traditions, born out of dread and necessity, explanations for disease, sudden death, and the mysteries of decay. They were practical in their own way, warnings woven into everyday life. And it was from this foundation that Stoker's count would eventually be built. In the villages scattered across the Balkans and the Carpathians, the idea of the revenant, the one who returns, was never distant. Death was not a clean separation. It was a threshold, and sometimes it was thought to be poorly sealed. The Strigoi in Romanian belief, the Vricolakas in Greek islands, the Upir in Slavic lands, all carried variations of the same dread, the corpse that walks again, feeding not only on blood, but on the vitality of the living. These beings were not always described as elegant or aristocratic. More often they were swollen, ruddy, and grotesque, their bodies bloated with the blood they had consumed. When unearthed, their corpses were said to appear too fresh, with open eyes and mouths stained red, as though they had fed even in the grave. Such stories were not abstract. They were tied directly to events that terrified communities. A sudden outbreak of plague, the unexplained wasting away of livestock, or a family struck by illness after a funeral. These could all be interpreted as signs that a restless dead was feeding on the living. Villagers did not respond with novels or sermons, but with action. They would dig up the suspected corpse, examine it for signs of unnatural preservation, and perform rituals to ensure it could not harm the living again. These rituals varied. Sometimes the heart was pierced with a stake. Sometimes the head was severed. Sometimes the body was burned to ash. And in many accounts, the ritual ended with the belief that peace had been restored to the community. It is easy for modern readers to dismiss these accounts as superstition, but to the villagers who lived with them, they were matters of survival. Medicine offered few explanations for sudden illness. Germs and microbes were unknown, but the idea that the dead could linger and drain the life of the living provided a narrative that explained the otherwise inexplicable. It also gave communities a ritual framework to confront their fear. By exhuming the corpse, by driving the stake or lighting the fire, they were taking control over what seemed uncontrollable. The vampire was less a monster lurking in the night than a problem to be solved, a threat to be managed through ritual. The word vampire itself began to appear in Western Europe in the early 18th century, carried on the reports of soldiers, administrators, and scholars who encountered these practices in the Balkans. One of the most famous cases came from Serbia in the 1720s, when Austrian officials recorded the exhumation of a peasant named Peter Plogojevich, whose neighbors claimed he had returned from the grave to attack them. The officials noted that his corpse showed no signs of decay, that his mouth was smeared with blood, and that when they drove a stake through his body, fresh blood spurted out. Such reports were copied and circulated across Europe, igniting debates among theologians and intellectuals about whether vampires truly existed. For Enlightenment thinkers, these accounts were both disturbing and fascinating. They revealed that in the supposedly modern age, entire communities still lived under the sway of ancient fears. These 18th century vampire panics spread far beyond local folklore. They entered the press, the salons, and the universities of Western Europe. Voltaire wrote skeptically about them, suggesting that if there were real vampires, they were not in Transylvania, but among the financiers of Paris who drained the people through usury. Scholars debated whether the corpses described in these reports were truly supernatural or simply cases of misunderstood natural decay. But whether believed or mocked, the idea of the vampire entered the European imagination. It became a symbol of irrational superstition on one hand and of uncanny possibility on the other. It was no longer just a local ghost story. It was a phenomenon that reached across borders. The rituals themselves reveal much about the fears that shaped them. The use of a wooden stake, often made of ash or oak, was not arbitrary. These were woods associated with strength and resilience, believed to bind or destroy the unquiet spirit. Piercing the heart symbolized striking at the seat of vitality. Severing the head removed the possibility of sight or speech. Burning reduced the body to ash, leaving nothing for the revenant to return to. Each act was both practical and symbolic, designed to sever the ties between the corpse and the living. Garlic, so famously associated with vampires, was used because of its pungent odor and perceived protective properties, a plant thought to repel evil. Holy water and crucifixes added another layer, blending Christian ritual with older folk practices. When we trace these traditions, we find that the vampire was never simply one thing. In some tales, it was a malicious spirit returned to torment its family. In others, it was a plague bringer whose presence explained epidemic disease. In others still, it was the restless dead who had died unbaptized, violently or with unfinished business, unable to move peacefully into the afterlife. The vampire was a catch-all figure for the anxieties of death, disease, and disorder. It was the fear that the dead did not stay buried, that the boundary between life and death was fragile. This folklore provided fertile ground for literature. By the 19th century, the vampire had already made its way into Western fiction. John Polidori's 1819 story, The Vampire, introduced the figure of Lord Ruthven, an aristocratic predator who seduces and destroys. Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, published in 1872, gave the vampire a more sensual, explicitly feminine form, weaving together themes of desire and dread. These works shifted the image of the vampire away from the bloated peasant corpse and toward the elegant figure that would culminate in Dracula. But even as these literary vampires emerged, they still carried echoes of the soil from which they had sprung. Ruthven and Carmilla were aristocrats, but their predation echoed the old belief that the dead feed on the living. Their elegance was new, but their essence was old. It is striking to note how much of Stoker's novel preserves the logic of folklore even as it transforms it. Dracula must return to his coffin filled with the soil of his homeland. He casts no reflection, echoing the belief that the vampire is a distortion of life. He can be repelled by garlic, crucifixes, and holy water, all staples of folk tradition. He controls wolves and bats, animals already associated with darkness and death. These are not inventions of the 19th century, but the continuation of centuries-old practices, translated into the language of Gothic fiction. To the Victorian reader, this blend of folklore and modern narrative was part of what made Dracula so powerful. He was not an abstract monster, but one rooted in recognizable traditions. His existence could be traced to the land beyond the forest, to the stories told by peasants, to the rituals of exhumation that had shocked Europe less than 2 centuries earlier. He carried with him the weight of folklore, now dressed in the clothes of aristocracy. He was the folk vampire elevated, the peasant revenant refined into a count. And yet, the very persistence of these beliefs raises a deeper question. Why did the figure of the vampire endure when so many other folk creatures faded? Part of the answer lies in its adaptability. The vampire was not tied to a single form. It could be a bloated corpse, a shadowy spirit, or an aristocratic seducer. It could represent disease, lust, or the corruption of power. It could haunt a village or stalk the streets of a modern city. Unlike other supernatural beings tied to specific contexts, the vampire was endlessly malleable, able to absorb new fears while retaining its essence. That adaptability is what allowed it to survive from the soil of folklore into the pages of Gothic novels. When we see Dracula standing in his castle, we are seeing the culmination of this long process. Behind his aristocratic mask lie centuries of villagers digging up graves, of soldiers reporting panics, of scholars debating superstition. Behind his sharp teeth lie the wooden stakes driven into countless corpses by desperate communities. Behind his Transylvanian castle lie the cemeteries where crosses leaned against the weight of fear. He is not an invention in isolation. He is a gathering of centuries, a condensation of folklore into a single unforgettable figure. From these foundations, it becomes easier to see how Stoker could fuse the vampire with another figure drawn from history. For as powerful as folklore was, it gained an even darker potency when bound to the memory of a real man, a ruler whose reputation for cruelty had already made him legendary. To see how the folkloric vampire merged with the historical prince is to understand how Dracula became not only a literary monster, but a cultural icon. If the folklore of revenants provided the soil from which the vampire myth grew, it was the memory of a flesh and blood ruler that gave Dracula his face. In the middle of the 15th century, when much of Europe was still divided into fragile kingdoms and principalities, the region of Wallachia produced a prince whose brutality was so infamous that his name still provokes fascination and dread. He was known to his people as Vlad III, son of Vlad Dracula, and to history as Vlad the Impaler. His rule was marked by blood, by terror, and by acts of cruelty so extreme that centuries later they seemed to demand explanation. For Bram Stoker, drawing on whispers of this prince gave his fictional vampire a historical anchor, a sense of authenticity that set him apart from other Gothic creations. Wallachia, a principality situated between the Carpathian Mountains and the Danube River, was in the 15th century a frontier land. It lay at the edge of Christian Europe, facing constant pressure from the expanding Ottoman Empire to the south, and entangled in rivalries with Hungary and other neighbouring powers. To rule Wallachia was to walk a narrow path between powerful enemies, balancing diplomacy with force and constantly struggling to maintain autonomy. Vlad III inherited this precarious position, and his response was ruthless determination. He would not be a pliant vassal. He would make himself feared. Born in 1431 in the Transylvanian city of Sighișoara, Vlad was the son of Vlad II Dracula, a member of the Order of the Dragon, a chivalric order founded to defend Christendom against the Ottomans. The name Dracula meant dragon, derived from the Latin Draco, and it was this name that would later pass to his son. Vlad III became known as Dracula, the son of Dracula, or literally the son of the dragon. In the original context, this was a title of honor, a connection to a knightly order, but in later folklore, Dracula took on a darker resonance, meaning not only dragon, but also devil. The transformation of this title from a mark of prestige to one of dread is emblematic of the larger transformation of Vlad himself from prince to monster. Vlad's early life was shaped by betrayal and captivity. In 1442, his father was forced to hand over Vlad and his younger brother Radu to the Ottoman court as hostages, a guarantee of his loyalty. The boys were raised in the Sultan's household, exposed to both the luxuries and the discipline of Ottoman power. Vlad learned Turkish, studied military tactics, and saw firsthand the machinery of empire. But captivity also instilled in him a deep mistrust and resentment. When his father and elder brother were murdered by rivals back in Wallachia, Vlad's sense of loyalty fractured. He escaped captivity and returned home, determined not only to reclaim his throne, but to rule with such terror that no one would dare betray him again. His reigns, he ruled in 3 non-consecutive periods between 1448 and 1476, were characterized by extreme measures of control. The most infamous of these was his use of impalement as a form of execution and intimidation. Victims were mounted on long wooden stakes driven through the body, sometimes vertically, sometimes horizontally, and left to die slowly in agony while their corpses rotted in public view. By some accounts, entire forests of impaled bodies lined the roads leading to his strongholds, a grotesque spectacle designed to terrify both his enemies and his own subjects into submission. Chroniclers, especially those hostile to him, recorded scenes of 20,000 corpses impaled at once, turning the landscape into a vision of hell. It is easy to view such accounts as exaggerations, and indeed many were produced by Saxon merchants and Hungarian rivals eager to vilify him. But even stripped of hyperbole, Vlad's cruelty was undeniable. He punished theft, treason, and even minor infractions with merciless severity. He was said to invite nobles to banquets, only to have them executed mid-feast. He staged elaborate displays of punishment to enforce order in a land riven by factionalism and betrayal. For his supporters, these acts were framed as necessary discipline, a ruler's iron hand imposed on a turbulent principality. For his enemies, they were evidence of a sadistic tyrant who reveled in blood. What cannot be denied is the psychological impact of his methods. Vlad understood that power rested as much on perception as on force. By cultivating an image of pitiless cruelty, he made rebellion unthinkable. By lining roads with the impaled, he created an aura of dread that extended far beyond Wallachia. Even the Ottomans, a formidable military power, recoiled at the sight of his handiwork. When Sultan Mehmed II advanced into Wallachia with an enormous army in 1462, he reportedly turned back in horror after encountering a vast field of corpses impaled outside Targovište, Vlad's capital. This spectacle, remembered as the Forest of the Impaled, may have been the most grotesque form of psychological warfare in medieval Europe. And yet, Vlad's legacy is not simple villainy. To Romanians, particularly in later centuries, he became a symbol of resistance against foreign domination, a ruler who defended his land against overwhelming odds. His cruelty was remembered, but so too was his defiance. He was celebrated as a nationalist hero who stood against the Ottoman tide. Stories of his harsh justice were reframed as examples of fairness. He punished nobles and peasants alike, enforcing an austere order in a lawless land. This duality, tyrant to some, hero to others, helped ensure his memory would not fade. It was this ambiguity that made him ripe for transformation into a figure of legend. To Western Europeans, who learned of him primarily through lurid pamphlets and hostile chronicles, he was a bloodthirsty monster. To his own people, he was a harsh but necessary ruler. The gap between these perspectives created the space in which myth could flourish. By the time Bram Stoker encountered the name Dracula in his research, it already carried the weight of centuries of rumor and fascination. Stoker never directly equated his vampire with Vlad the Impaler, but the connection was strong enough that readers and later interpreters fused the two. The historical prince gave the fictional count a foundation in reality, and the fictional count gave the historical prince an immortality he could never have imagined. The association between Vlad and vampirism was not immediate. Contemporary accounts of his cruelty did not describe him as a blood drinker. That element belonged to folklore, but his reputation for excessive cruelty, his love of theatrical displays of death, and his connection to the name Dracula created fertile ground for the fusion. The impalements, grotesque as they were, carried a symbolic resonance with the idea of feeding on life. The forests of corpses, swaying in the wind, could be read as a vampiric landscape, a land drained of vitality by its own ruler. Even if Vlad never drank blood, his legend suggested a man whose hunger for control was insatiable, whose relationship with death was intimate, and whose cruelty seemed beyond the human. Stoker's notes show that he was aware of Vlad, though how much he knew remains debated. He copied references to Dracula from sources that describe the prince as a great warrior and as one feared for his cruelty. He may have seen in the name not only a historical resonance, but a linguistic advantage. Dracula sounded exotic, foreign, and threatening, perfect for a villain meant to embody otherness. Whether or not Stoker intended a direct link, the fusion was inevitable. Readers made the connection, and over time, the historical and the fictional became inseparable in popular imagination. What is striking is how the figure of Vlad bridges the gap between folklore and fiction. On one side lies the peasant superstition of revenants rising from the grave. On the other side lies the literary aristocrat of Gothic novels. Vlad provided a human figure who could embody both. He was aristocratic, ruling from castles and surrounded by the trappings of nobility. But he was also monstrous, reveling in death and cruelty. He stood at the intersection of history and myth, ready to be claimed by literature as something more than either. The story of Vlad the Impaler also underscores the importance of place. His rule was inseparable from Wallachia, from the frontier landscape where empires collided. It was a land where cruelty could be rationalized as survival, where terror could be wielded as a weapon. This is why his memory survived, not just as a man, but as a symbol. He was not only a ruler, he was the embodiment of a land caught between worlds, between East and West, between Christendom and Islam, between survival and annihilation. In this sense, his transformation into Dracula was natural. The fictional count, like the historical prince, belonged to the borderlands, to the place where boundaries collapse and the extraordinary becomes possible. When we step back and look at Vlad's legacy, we see both the horror and the fascination that made him immortal. He was a man of contradictions, hero and tyrant, patriot and sadist, dragon and devil. His cruelty was unforgettable, but so was his defiance. His memory was preserved not only in chronicles, but in folklore, not only in Romania, but across Europe. And when Stoker's novel appeared, it found in him the perfect historical echo to give its villain weight. The line between Vlad the Impaler and Count Dracula may be blurred, but it is precisely this blurring that has allowed both to endure. From the soil of folklore and the blood of history, Dracula emerged as a figure both real and unreal. But his transformation was not complete until Stoker himself shaped him into a literary creation, fusing fact and legend into a novel that would redefine the vampire forever. The line between the man and the myth is never drawn in ink. It is drawn in rumor, in story, in the selective memory of those who either feared or admired him. Vlad the Impaler began his life as a prince in a fractured land, and in his lifetime he was many things. A warrior who defended Wallachia against the Ottomans, a ruler who imposed order on a turbulent nobility, and a man whose brutality made him infamous. But the way he moved from warrior to monster is not simply the story of his actions. It is the story of how his memory was shaped, distorted, and ultimately fused with older fears, until the man became inseparable from the legend of Dracula. During his reign, Vlad's cruelty was known and feared, but it was also understood in context. He lived in a century where public executions were common, where rulers everywhere used violence as a tool of power. Impalement was shocking, yes, but it was also effective, and in a land constantly under threat, effectiveness was valued above mercy. To his allies, Vlad could be a stern but just ruler. To his enemies, he was a tyrant. But once he was gone, once his corpse was no longer on the throne to explain or justify his acts, his reputation was left to be shaped by those who told the stories. And stories have their own hunger. They feed on detail, on exaggeration, on the imagination of those who retell them. It was the Saxon merchants of Transylvania who first began to cast him as something beyond human cruelty. They had reason to hate him. Vlad had punished them for defying his trade policies, and entire towns had been put to the stake. When they carried tales of his reign back to their German-speaking audiences, they painted him not as a stern ruler, but as a sadistic monster. Pamphlets printed in the late 15th and early 16th centuries circulated across Europe, illustrated with woodcuts showing Vlad dining among impaled corpses or boiling men alive. In these images, he was less a prince and more a fiend who reveled in suffering. The printing press, still a relatively new technology, spread these accounts widely, giving Vlad a posthumous notoriety that no other regional prince could match. In these pamphlets, we see the first transformation. Vlad is no longer just a warrior. He is a spectacle, a figure of horror for audiences far beyond Wallachia. To Germans and Hungarians, he was proof of barbarity in the East, a story to be told with a mixture of fascination and disgust. To Romanians, who remembered him differently, this was a distortion, an exaggeration designed by enemies. But for the myth, the exaggeration mattered more than the truth. It was in these lurid accounts that the seeds of Dracula as a monster were first sown. The details lingered in European imagination. One pamphlet told of Vlad nailing hats to the heads of envoys who refused to remove them in his presence. Another described how he invited beggars to a feast, only to lock the doors and burn the hall to the ground, proclaiming that he had rid his land of poverty. Still others claimed he delighted in drinking the blood of his victims, a detail that may have been metaphorical at first, but which took on a more literal meaning in later retellings. Whether or not Vlad ever actually did such things was irrelevant. Once the stories were written and illustrated, they became part of his identity. The connection between blood and cruelty was particularly powerful. Blood is not only the symbol of violence, but of life itself, and to suggest that Vlad delighted in blood was to suggest he was not merely cruel, but unnatural. This is where the old folklore of revenants intersected with his legend. In lands where people already feared the restless dead, a ruler who seemed to revel in bloodshed could easily be imagined as something more than human. Even if Vlad never drank blood, the association was irresistible. It was only a short step from tyrant to vampire. The transformation of Vlad's name also played a role. As the son of Vlad Dracul, he inherited the title Dracula, the son of the dragon. But in Romanian, Dracul could also mean devil. To Western ears, this sounded ominous, demonic, a perfect fit for the monstrous image already being shaped. The word itself became a bridge between history and myth. When Bram Stoker encountered it centuries later, he was not just taking a name. He was inheriting all the ambiguity and dread that had already been attached to it. Over time, Vlad's memory fractured into two competing images. In Romanian oral tradition, he remained a figure of justice, feared but respected, a ruler who protected his land from invaders and punished corruption without mercy. Tales were told of how he would place a golden cup at a well in Târgoviște, and no one dared steal it, so great was their fear of his retribution. He was remembered as harsh, but fair, a man who imposed order in a lawless time. In German pamphlets and Western chronicles, he was remembered only as a monster, a ruler whose cruelty surpassed all others. The truth may have lain somewhere in between, but myths are rarely interested in balance. The fusion of Vlad's legend with vampire folklore was gradual, shaped not by a single moment, but by centuries of association. By the 18th century, when reports of vampirism spread through Europe, the figure of Dracula was already lurking in the background as a symbol of cruelty and blood. To attach the name of Vlad to the idea of the vampire was natural, even inevitable. By the 19th century, when Gothic literature was flourishing, the groundwork was ready. A cruel prince, a name associated with dragons and devils, and a folklore filled with blood-drinking revenants. All the pieces were in place. Bram Stoker may not have intended to make his Dracula directly identical with Vlad, but he could not resist borrowing the weight of his name. In his notes, he jotted down references to a great warrior prince who fought against the Turks and was feared for his cruelty. He replaced the more generic Count Vampire with the far more evocative Count Dracula. Whether he realized the full implications or not, he had tied his creation to a real historical figure whose legend already blurred into myth. From that moment, the two became inseparable. Vlad gave the Count his name, his homeland, and his aura of cruelty. Stoker gave Vlad immortality as the world's most famous vampire. What we see in this transformation is the way history and folklore intertwine. A man commits acts of cruelty. His enemies exaggerate them, stories spread, and over centuries, those stories merge with other myths until the man is no longer just a man. He becomes a symbol, a legend, a monster. Vlad the Impaler lived and died in the 15th century, but through the machinery of rumor, print, and literature, he became Dracula. He moved from warrior to monster, not because of what he was, but because of what he was remembered to be. This process reveals something fundamental about the vampire itself. Vampires are creatures of memory. They rise from graves because the living cannot forget them, because their presence lingers after death. In the same way, Vlad could not be buried by history. His cruelty, his defiance, his name, all refused to decay. They lingered, feeding on retelling after retelling, until he rose again in another form. Dracula is, in a sense, Vlad's revenant, his restless afterlife in the imagination of the world. But Stoker's vampire was more than just the echo of a historical tyrant. To create him, the novelist wove together folklore, history, and fiction into something larger, something that could stand not only in the forests of Transylvania, but in the heart of modern London. To see how the Count took his final form, we must step into the study where Bram Stoker worked, surrounded by notes, maps, and borrowed accounts, shaping the most famous vampire of them all. By the time the 19th century neared its close, the figure of the vampire was already present in European imagination. Folklore had carried it through village cemeteries, scholars had debated it in university halls, and writers had dressed it in the cloaks of aristocracy. But it was Bram Stoker who gave it its most enduring form. His novel did not appear in a vacuum. It was the product of his life, his obsessions, the culture of his time, and the Gothic tradition that had been growing for more than a century. To understand how Dracula was born, we must step into the world of Stoker himself and the influences that shaped his creation. Abraham Stoker was born in Dublin in 1847, the third of 7 children in a middle-class Protestant family. His early years were marked by illness. Bedridden until the age of 7, he grew up listening to stories told by his mother Charlotte, who filled the long hours with tales of Irish folklore, superstition, and ghosts. These early impressions mattered. They showed him how stories could give shape to fear and how the supernatural could be woven into the fabric of everyday life. When he recovered and grew into a strong, athletic young man, he carried with him not only a fascination with the strange, but also a determination to channel it into his writing. Stoker's career, however, was not initially literary. He studied mathematics at Trinity College, worked as a civil servant, and began writing reviews for Dublin newspapers. His reviews of theatre productions drew the attention of actors, and in 1878 he became the business manager for Henry Irving, one of the most famous actors of the age. For the next 3 decades, Stoker worked closely with Irving at London's Lyceum Theatre, handling the business of productions while living in the shadow of a man who commanded audiences with his performances. The experience shaped Stoker deeply. Irving's charisma, his ability to dominate a stage, and his almost hypnotic presence provided a living model for what a larger-than-life character could be. Many scholars believe that Stoker modelled aspects of Dracula's aristocratic bearing on Irving himself, a man whose power over others came not from violence but from sheer personality. It was during these years that Stoker began to research and plan the novel that would become Dracula. He was not working from imagination alone. He was meticulous, filling notebooks with clippings, notes, and details drawn from a wide array of sources. He consulted travel accounts of Eastern Europe, including Emily Gerard's The Land Beyond the Forest, which introduced him to Transylvanian superstitions and the word Noseratu. He studied maps of the region to plot Jonathan Harker's journey with precision. He read histories of Vlad the Impaler, noting the name Dracula and its associations with dragons and devils. He borrowed from medical texts, folklore collections, and even newspaper reports of premature burials. His vampire was not plucked from thin air. It was assembled piece by piece from a wide field of research. The Gothic tradition also provided a framework. For more than a century, Gothic novels had explored themes of horror, the uncanny, and the collapse of boundaries. Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto had set the stage in 1764 with its haunted castle and supernatural elements. Anne Radcliffe, Matthew Lewis, and Charles Maturin had added their own layers of mystery, horror, and psychological torment. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein had given the Gothic a new dimension, merging science with horror and creating a figure both monstrous and sympathetic. By the time Stoker was writing, Gothic fiction had become both familiar and popular, a genre that offered readers a safe way to explore fear. Dracula fit neatly into this lineage, but it also expanded it, giving the Gothic a figure who could move across borders, who could be both aristocrat and monster, both ancient and modern. One of the most striking aspects of Stoker's novel is its structure. Rather than telling the story through a single narrator, he constructed it as a collection of documents, journal entries, letters, newspaper clippings, and reports. This epistolary form gave the novel a sense of authenticity, as though it were not fiction but a case file, pieced together from evidence. It also allowed multiple perspectives, shifting from Harker's terror in Transylvania to Mina's careful notes, Seward's medical observations, and newspaper accounts of strange occurrences in London. The effect was cumulative. Each perspective added another layer, building a sense of dread not through a single voice, but through the convergence of many. The reader was invited to be part of the investigation, to sift through the evidence and piece together the truth. The choice of form also reflected the anxieties of the age. The late 19th century was a time when information was multiplying rapidly. Newspapers, telegrams, typewriters, and shorthand were transforming how people communicated and recorded their world. Dracula's structure mirrored this, presenting a world where knowledge was fragmented, where truth had to be assembled from disparate pieces, and where the supernatural intruded into the very systems designed to organize reality. The vampire was not just a monster, he was a disruption of the modern order of information. Stoker's novel also reflected the fears and fascinations of Victorian society. The 1890s were a decade of unease. The British Empire was vast, but felt increasingly fragile, threatened by rivals abroad and by anxieties about degeneration at home. Scientific advances raised questions about evolution, heredity, and the boundaries of life. Sexuality was both a subject of fascination and repression, with moral codes clashing against desires that could not be openly expressed. Immigration and urbanization created fears of contamination and invasion. Dracula brought all of these anxieties together in one figure. He was the foreign invader who came from the East, threatening to corrupt English purity. He was the aristocrat who fed on the blood of the middle class, echoing class tensions. He was a figure of sexual transgression, whose bite carried undertones of desire and violation. He was a creature who defied science, neither alive nor dead, resistant to medicine and immune to reason. The writing of the novel was a long process. Stoker worked on it throughout the 1890s, revising and reshaping until it became the sprawling, detailed work that was finally published in 1897. When it appeared, it was not immediately hailed as a masterpiece. Reviews were generally favourable but not ecstatic. It was praised as a good example of Gothic fiction, thrilling and frightening, but it was not yet recognised as the defining vampire story it would become. In the years that followed, the novel sold steadily but quietly, overshadowed at times by more sensational works. It was only in the 20th century, as Dracula moved from page to stage to screen, that its full power was realized. Part of what gave the novel its lasting strength was the care Stoker took in grounding the supernatural in the real. He made the journey to Transylvania believable through detailed geography. He made the vampire's threat tangible by embedding it in the streets of London, in railway timetables, in shipping records. He gave his characters the tools of modern science, medicine, psychology, typewriters, phonographs, only to show that these could be tested and found wanting against an ancient power. The collision of modernity and myth gave the story its resonance. Readers could believe that Dracula existed because he was placed so firmly in a recognizable world. The character of Dracula himself was carefully crafted. Stoker gave him an aristocratic dignity, a sense of age, and a set of powers that drew from folklore but were shaped for narrative effect. He could control animals, command storms, and transform his shape. He could only enter a home if invited, a rule that spoke to anxieties about invasion and consent. He was bound to his coffin of native earth, a detail that tied him to the land and to the folklore of revenants. He was monstrous, but he was also intelligent, strategic, and charismatic. He was not a mindless ghoul. He was a predator who understood the world he was entering. This combination of attributes made him a villain unlike any other, a creature who was terrifying not only because of his powers, but because of his cunning. It is also important to note that Stoker did not create Dracula in isolation. He was influenced by earlier vampire literature. Polidori's The Vampire and Le Fanu's Carmilla had already introduced the aristocratic and seductive vampire. But Stoker synthesized these influences into something more expansive, more rooted in folklore, more connected to place and history. He took the aristocratic predator, gave him the name of a real prince, tied him to a specific geography, and placed him in direct confrontation with modern England. The result was not just another vampire story, but the vampire story, the one that would eclipse all others. Stoker himself never lived to see the full impact of his creation. He died in 1912, before the explosion of film adaptations that would make Dracula a household name. For him, the novel was part of a larger career, one work among several, though it was his most ambitious. It was only later, as stage plays and movies transformed the Count into a cultural icon, that Stoker's work was recognized as the foundation of an entire genre. Looking back, it is clear that Dracula was not simply a product of one man's imagination, but of a convergence. It was the convergence of folklore, history, Gothic tradition, and Victorian anxiety. It was the convergence of personal experience, Stoker's fascination with Irving's presence, his childhood tales of the uncanny, his meticulous research, and cultural mood. It was the convergence of old fears and new technologies, of medieval superstition and modern rationality. Out of this convergence, a figure was born who could stride across centuries, adapting to each new age while retaining his essence. From here, the story of Dracula shifts. The Count is no longer confined to the study where Stoker wrote him, or to the pages of the 1897 novel. He emerges into the world, armed with the powers Stoker gave him, ready to inhabit castles, theatres, and eventually cinemas. But before we follow his shadow into popular culture, we must pause within the novel itself to look closely at the architecture of Stoker's creation, at the details of his castle, his journey, and the way the text itself became a labyrinth of terror. When Bram Stoker built his vampire, he did not simply imagine a character. He built a world around him, a stage that carried as much symbolic weight as the Count himself. At the heart of this world stood a castle, not merely as scenery, but as a presence, a labyrinth of stone and shadow that was both fortress and prison, both history and metaphor. To step into Dracula's castle is to step into the architecture of Gothic imagination, where every corridor and locked door speaks to the deeper fears Stoker was weaving into his tale. The castle first appears to us through Jonathan Harker's eyes, and this perspective is important. Harker is not a romantic wanderer, not a hero seeking adventure. He is a solicitor, a man of ledgers and contracts, dispatched to arrange a real estate deal. His tools are timetables, train tickets, and a notebook. He is the embodiment of the modern professional class, practical and rational. And yet, as his carriage winds through the Carpathians, his world begins to slip. The peasants cross themselves at the name of his destination. Wolves howl in the forests. The carriage driver seems to vanish into mist. By the time the castle comes into view, looming above the valley, it is already marked as something outside the ordinary. Stoker describes the castle in ways that emphasize its dual nature. It is ancient and crumbling, a relic of another age, but it is also formidable, a a stronghold that defies intrusion. Its walls rise out of the rock as though grown from it, blending the man-made and the natural. Its corridors twist and turn, leading to locked doors, blocked passageways, and sudden drops. Time feels suspended within it. Harker notices that the furnishings are old-fashioned, the rooms dusty, the mirrors absent. It is a place that resists modernity, as though frozen in an earlier century. Yet it is not merely decayed, it is alive with menace. The longer Harker spends within it, the more he realizes it is not simply a house but a trap. The castle functions on several levels. On the surface, it is a setting, a Gothic backdrop of towers, battlements, and hidden chambers. But more deeply, it is a psychological space, a representation of entrapment and disorientation. Harker, who began his journey confident in the tools of modern reason, finds himself caught in a maze where none of those tools apply. He cannot map its corridors, cannot find an exit, cannot even rely on time passing in a rational way. The castle erodes his sense of control, leaving him vulnerable to the presence of its master. In this sense, it is less a physical building than a state of mind, a structure designed to dissolve certainty. It is also a symbol of aristocratic power. In the Victorian imagination, the castle was not simply an architectural form, but a relic of feudalism. It represented an older order, one in which lords ruled by blood and lineage, in which peasants lived under the shadow of their masters. To place Dracula in a castle was to emphasize his connection to this older system of power, one that lingered uneasily in a world supposedly governed by law and commerce. Harker's imprisonment in the castle mirrors the subjugation of the peasant by the lord. The Count is not bound by contracts or timetables. He is bound only by the ancient rules of his own making. The castle is the physical embodiment of that power, a structure built not for comfort, but for domination. At the same time, the castle is profoundly isolated. Its position high in the mountains cuts it off from the world, accessible only by treacherous paths. This isolation mirrors Dracula himself, a figure who is ancient, powerful, and cut off from the flow of modern life. It is no accident that his plan in the novel involves leaving the castle and establishing himself in London. The castle is his fortress, but it is also his prison. He must bring his soil with him to survive elsewhere, but he cannot truly escape the aura of his home. The castle is both his source of power and his cage. The imagery of the castle also resonates with the Gothic tradition. Castles had been central to Gothic fiction since Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, where they served as places of secrets, hauntings, and inherited curses. In Radcliffe's novels, they were labyrinths of mystery. In Lewis's The Monk, they became sites of corruption and hidden desire. Stoker's castle continues this tradition, but with a sharper edge. It is not haunted by ghosts of the past. It is haunted by its living master, who is himself a kind of ghost. It is not simply mysterious. It is actively predatory, designed to disorient and ensnare. The Gothic castle had always been a symbol of the past pressing on the present. In Dracula, it becomes the incubator of a threat that will soon break into the modern world. Harker's experience inside the castle captures this tension perfectly. At first, he tries to treat it as a normal lodging, taking meals, exploring rooms, writing notes, but gradually he realizes that every step he takes is controlled. The doors are locked, the stairways lead nowhere, windows open onto sheer drops. He begins to understand that he is not a guest, but a captive. The realization dawns slowly, like the tightening of a snare, until it is unbearable, and then the more overt horrors reveal themselves. Dracula crawling down the wall like a lizard, the discovery of his coffin, the terrifying encounter with the vampire brides. The castle strips Harker of his illusions piece by piece until he is reduced to desperate survival. This structure, beginning with unease, building through disorientation, and culminating in terror, mirrors the architecture of the novel itself. The castle is the microcosm of Dracula's world, the template for what will happen later in London. Just as Harker is trapped within its walls, so too will Mina and Lucy be trapped by the Count's influence. Just as the castle's corridors defy reason, so too will the vampire's powers defy the rational tools of science. The architecture of the castle is the architecture of the novel, a labyrinth in which the reader too becomes ensnared. There is also something dreamlike about the castle, as though it belongs more to the unconscious than to geography. Doors appear where they should not. Windows open onto voids. Time moves irregularly. Harker's sense of reality is eroded, leaving him in a state that feels more like nightmare than waking life. This quality has led many to read the castle as a metaphor for the mind itself, a place of repression, secrets, and forbidden desires. Dracula, then, is not only the master of the castle, but the master of the unconscious, the figure who embodies what reason cannot control. The physical details of the castle reinforce this impression. The absence of mirrors suggests a world where reflection, self-awareness, and rational order have no place. The dust and decay speak to a time that has stopped moving forward. The wolves outside the walls howl as extensions of the Count's will, reminding us that even the natural world bends to his command. The very stones seem infused with his presence. The castle is not merely where Dracula lives, it is Dracula. It is his body, his domain, his psyche given form in stone. And yet, as terrifying as the castle is, it is also strangely alluring. Gothic architecture has always carried a double quality. It repels and attracts, horrifies and fascinates. The same is true here. Readers may recoil at the locked doors and crawling shadows, but they are also drawn deeper, compelled to explore the labyrinth alongside Harker. The castle is a place of fear, but it is also the place where the reader most wants to be, because it is where the mystery lies. This tension between horror and fascination is at the heart of the Gothic, and Stoker exploits it brilliantly. When Dracula finally leaves the castle and travels to England, the architecture of the story changes. The labyrinth of corridors is replaced by the labyrinth of city streets. The isolation of the mountain fortress is replaced by the anonymity of urban life. But the castle never fully disappears. Its aura follows him, carried in the boxes of earth that he brings with him, in the uncanny presence that invades English homes, in the sense that even in modern London, the shadow of the ancient fortress looms. The castle is both a place on a map and a psychological state. Once entered, it is never entirely left behind. This is why the castle remains central in every adaptation of Dracula. Even when filmmakers alter the story, move the setting, or reinvent the character, the image of the fortress perched on a cliff remains. It has become as iconic as the Count himself, the stage without which the drama cannot begin. Viewers expect to see it, readers expect to enter it, because it is the architecture of the myth. Dracula without his castle would not be the same creature. He would be untethered, lacking the physical embodiment of his power. The architecture of Stoker's Dracula, then, is not incidental. It is essential. It shapes the experience of the characters, the rhythm of the story, and the fears of the reader. It embodies the themes of isolation, entrapment, aristocratic power, and the collapse of reason. It is at once fortress, labyrinth, prison, and nightmare. And through it, Stoker gave his vampire a home as unforgettable as the figure himself. From the shadows of this fortress, the Count emerges into a wider world. No longer confined to his stone walls, he spreads his influence outward, transforming into creatures of the night, commanding wolves and bats, dissolving into mist. The architecture of the castle prepares us for this expansion, showing us that Dracula is not bound by ordinary rules of space or form. To follow him now, we must step into the realm of transformation, where the predator of the night reveals the full extent of his powers. From the walls of his castle, Dracula emerges not only as a man, but as something far less confined. He is not tethered to the form that greets Jonathan Harker at the door. His power comes from his ability to slip past categories, to dissolve boundaries, to become something other than human whenever he chooses. This capacity for transformation is one of the most striking features of Stoker's vampire, setting him apart from earlier revenants of folklore and giving him the versatility that has allowed him to endure for more than a century. Dracula is not only a nobleman with a taste for blood, he is also bat, wolf, mist, and shadow. He is a predator in every sense, and to understand him fully, we must follow him into the forms he assumes when night falls. The connection between the vampire and the bat is perhaps the most iconic, so much so that it is difficult today to imagine one without the other. But this link did not exist in folklore. In Eastern European traditions, vampires were corpses that rose from the grave, bloated and red with blood. They did not fly, nor did they sprout wings. The bat-vampire connection emerged later, through the blending of Old World legend with New World discovery. When European naturalists first encountered the vampire bat in Central and South America in the 16th century, they were struck by the uncanny coincidence. Here was a creature that lived by drinking blood. Reports of these bats reached Europe and were soon folded into the growing lore of the vampire. By the 19th century, the association was too powerful to ignore. Stoker drew on it, making his count capable of dissolving into a bat, swooping silently through the night, invading bedrooms, and vanishing before dawn. The bat is a perfect symbol for Dracula. It is nocturnal, secretive, and unsettling. To Victorian readers, bats carried associations with darkness, decay, and the uncanny. They hung upside down in caves, dwelling in the same liminal spaces where folklore imagined ghosts and demons. To link Dracula with bats was to give him the attributes of a natural predator, one that struck unseen and fed directly on the lifeblood of others. But Stoker amplified this association, turning it from coincidence into metaphor. The bat was not only a physical form, it was the image of what Dracula truly was, a creature of the night, flitting just beyond the reach of human senses, always present, yet rarely seen until it was too late. Just as significant is Dracula's command over wolves. From the moment Harker approaches the castle, the wolves are there, howling in the forests, their cries echoing through the valleys. To the villagers, these howls are omens. To Dracula, they are music. Listen to them, the children of the night. What music they make, he says, in one of the novel's most memorable lines. The wolves are not his enemies, but his companions, his soldiers in fur. He can summon them, calm them, or unleash them on his victims. They embody the wildness of the land, the untamed nature that stands outside the order of civilization. To give Dracula mastery over them is to place him at the center of this wildness, not as a victim, but as its lord. The wolf has long been a symbol of predation, fear, and otherness. In European folklore, wolves stalked the edges of villages, symbols of the dangers lurking beyond the boundaries of human society. They were figures of hunger, cunning, and violence. To align Dracula with the wolf was to give him these attributes, to cast him as the embodiment of the predator waiting at the edge of the firelight. But again, Stoker went further. Dracula is not merely like a wolf, he commands them. He is the master of the wilderness, the one who bends the very forces of nature to his will. In this sense, his power is not only supernatural, but ecological. He is woven into the natural order, but in a way that reverses it. He is not prey, but predator, not hunted, but hunter. The ability to transform is not limited to bats and wolves. Dracula can also dissolve into mist, seeping through cracks and under doors, invading spaces without being seen. This form is perhaps the most uncanny of all, because it strips away any physical limit. Walls and locks mean nothing. He is not bound by the architecture that imprisons Harker. He can enter where he pleases, intangible yet suffocating. For mist is both insubstantial and overwhelming. It surrounds, envelops, and chokes. To imagine Dracula as mist is to imagine him as unavoidable, a presence that can infiltrate any space, no matter how secure. This ability to shift between forms blurs the line between categories: man, animal, weather. Dracula is all of these and none of them. He is a shapeshifter in the truest sense, a being who refuses to be fixed in one identity. This fluidity is part of what makes him so terrifying. He cannot be pinned down, cannot be contained. Just when the characters believe they understand him, he slips into another form, another threat. The uncertainty is as frightening as the transformation itself. There is also a symbolic dimension to this shape-shifting. In Victorian society, categories mattered. Science was busy classifying the natural world, medicine was defining diseases, criminology was categorizing deviance. Boundaries between human and animal, civilized and savage, male and female, were policed with intensity. Dracula violates all of these boundaries. By becoming wolf, bat, and mist, he embodies the fear of blurred categories, of a world where order dissolves. He is not simply a predator, he is a threat to the very structures of thought that hold society together. The choice of forms also reveals something about desire. The bat and the wolf are not only predators, they are also associated with danger that attracts as well as repels. Wolves had long been connected with forbidden sexuality, with the lure of the wild. Bats, with their silent flight and unsettling appearance, carried connotations of the uncanny, of things hidden from daylight. Mist, enveloping and suffocating, has been read as a metaphor for sexual violation. Dracula's transformations are not merely displays of power. They are enactments of forbidden desires, projections of what Victorian society repressed but could not eradicate. It is worth noting that Dracula's shape-shifting sets him apart from other vampires in literature. Polidori's Lord Ruthven did not turn into animals. Le Fanu's Carmilla was more spirit than beast. Folkloric vampires remained tethered to their corpses. Stoker's count, however, is protean, capable of slipping across forms at will. This versatility makes him both a continuation of folklore and a radical reinvention. It allows him to move from the Carpathian wilderness to the streets of London, from castle to townhouse, adapting to each new environment. His shape-shifting is what enables him to cross borders, both literal and symbolic. This adaptability has been one of the reasons for Dracula's endurance in popular culture. Later adaptations seized on the bat most strongly, turning it into the definitive image of the vampire. Films added visual spectacle to the transformation, showing Dracula dissolving into smoke or spreading his cape like wings. Each new version emphasized a different aspect, but the core remained the same. Dracula is never only himself. He is always something more, something shifting, something beyond. The presence of animals and transformation also ties him to older traditions of the werewolf. In Eastern Europe, the line between vampire and werewolf was not always clear. Some traditions spoke of the strigoi as shape-shifting creatures, capable of taking the form of animals as well as rising from the grave. In some regions, the same word could mean both vampire and werewolf. Stoker may have drawn on these traditions, whether directly or indirectly, fusing them into his count. Dracula is thus not only the heir of the vampire, but also of the werewolf, a hybrid figure who carries multiple strands of folklore in his body. When we step back and consider Dracula's transformations as a whole, we see that they are not random. Each form emphasizes an aspect of his nature. As bat, he is stealth and intrusion. As wolf, he is hunger and violence. As mist, he is inevitability and infiltration. Together, they create a portrait of a predator who is everywhere, in every form, in every shadow. The vampire is not confined to the coffin. It is in the skies, the forests, and the very air we breathe. The novel makes this explicit in the way characters struggle to combat him. How do you fight a man who is also a bat, a wolf, a mist? The tools of science and reason falter against such a figure. Locks cannot keep him out, weapons cannot strike what has no body, and reason cannot explain what shifts form before your eyes. This is why superstition, faith, and ritual remain necessary in the novel. It is only through crucifixes, garlic, and sacred wafers that Dracula can be held at bay. Modern tools are useless against a creature who is not bound by modern categories. In this way, Dracula's shape-shifting embodies the core theme of the novel, the collapse of boundaries. The line between East and West, past and present, life and death, man and beast, desire and fear, all blur in his presence. His transformations are not tricks but revelations. They show that identity itself is unstable, that what we think of as fixed is in fact fluid. This is what terrifies the characters, and it is what continues to fascinate readers. The predators of the night, then, are not merely companions or disguises. They are extensions of Dracula's being, facets of a figure who is always more than one thing at once. They make him a lord not only of his castle, but of the natural and supernatural worlds alike. To see him as wolf, bat, and mist is to see him as master of the night in all its forms. From this mastery, the novel turns toward those he ensnares, the figures whose fates are bound to his desire and hunger. If Dracula is lord of the predators, he is also master of seduction, drawing others into his orbit not only through fear, but through allure. To see the full extent of his power, we must look at those who fall under his sway, the brides who dwell in his castle, and the women whose lives are transformed by his bite. Among the many unsettling moments in Dracula, few are as haunting as Jonathan Harker's encounter with the three women who dwell within the castle. They appear suddenly, emerging from the shadows, described not with horror at first, but with an unnerving beauty. Harker, despite knowing the danger he is in, feels drawn toward them, compelled by a desire he cannot fully control. Their approach is intimate, their intent unmistakably sensual, and yet beneath the allure lies something predatory. They are the brides of the vampire, figures who embody the entanglement of desire and dread, the embodiment of everything Victorian society feared about the unrestrained woman. The scene is carefully crafted. Harker, isolated in the castle and increasingly aware of his captivity, lies awake in a state of vulnerability. The women emerge, described in terms that emphasize both their beauty and their unnatural qualities. Their lips are red, their eyes burn with a strange light, their voices are soft but insistent. They move toward him not with violence but with a languid sensuality, and Harker's response is telling. He feels a mixture of fear and longing, a recognition that what he is about to experience is both deadly and irresistible. When one of them lowers her mouth toward his throat, he does not recoil, but closes his eyes, awaiting the sensation with a mixture of dread and anticipation. It is only the sudden intervention of Dracula himself that prevents the act, as the Count pulls the women away and claims Harker for his own purposes. This moment crystallizes one of the central themes of the novel, the intersection of sex and death, desire and danger. The brides are not simply monsters, they are women whose sexuality is portrayed as dangerous, overwhelming and destructive. They invert the Victorian ideal of the passive, pure woman. Instead, they are active, aggressive, and unrestrained in their desire. They approach Harker not as objects of his pursuit, but as predators in their own right, reversing the traditional gender roles of seduction. For a Victorian audience, this reversal would have been both shocking and thrilling. The fear of female sexuality was deeply ingrained in the culture of the time. The Victorian woman was idealized as the angel in the house, pure, domestic, and devoted to husband and children. But beneath this ideal lay anxieties about desire, temptation, and the potential for women to transgress. Medical texts of the period often portrayed female sexuality as dangerous, capable of leading to hysteria, illness, or moral decay if not properly controlled. The figure of the sexually aggressive woman was not only taboo, but terrifying, a threat to the stability of family and society. The vampire brides gave this fear a face. They embodied the nightmare of women who desired not marriage or motherhood, but blood, pleasure, and dominance. At the same time, their allure cannot be denied. Stoker describes them with a fascination that mirrors Harker's own conflicted response. The scene is charged with eroticism, the act of biting clearly paralleling sexual intimacy. The danger is part of the attraction. This combination of fear and desire is at the heart of Gothic fiction, where what terrifies also fascinates. The brides seduce not only Harker, but the reader, drawing them into the uncomfortable recognition that repression and temptation are inseparable. Dracula's own relationship with the brides is revealing. He tolerates them, but controls them. He is angered when they move to feed on Harker, asserting his dominance and reminding them that the man is his property. This moment underscores the patriarchal hierarchy even within the supernatural. The women are powerful, but their power is contained by the Count. They are permitted to feed only on children or on victims assigned to them. Their independence is limited, their agency curtailed by the authority of the male vampire. This dynamic mirrors the gender structures of the society Stoker was writing in, where women's roles were both feared when expanded and restricted when challenged. The brides also serve as foils to the other women in the novel, particularly Mina Harker and Lucy Westenra. Mina is portrayed as the ideal Victorian woman, intelligent, devoted, and pure, assisting her husband and friends with selfless loyalty. Lucy, though innocent, becomes a victim of Dracula's bite, and transforms into something dangerously similar to the brides, a woman whose sexuality becomes predatory. After her transformation, Lucy preys on children, her beauty twisted into seduction, her gentleness into hunger. She becomes a reflection of the brides, showing how even the most innocent woman can be corrupted into something monstrous. The men who loved her are forced to destroy her, staking her body in a scene that is as much about restoring social order as it is about defeating the undead. The juxtaposition is clear. On one side stand Mina and the ideal of female virtue, contained, supportive, and pure. On the other stand the brides and the corrupted Lucy, figures of female desire unrestrained, dangerous, and destructive. The novel draws a stark line between these categories, reflecting the anxieties of its time. But at the same time, it cannot hide its fascination with the very thing it condemns. The most memorable scenes of the novel are not those of Mina's loyalty, but of the bride's seduction and Lucy's transformation. The repression of female sexuality may have been the moral message, but its expression provided the novel's most powerful imagery. The brides also connect Dracula to earlier traditions of female supernatural figures. In folklore, women who died before marriage, during childbirth, or under tragic circumstances were often imagined as restless spirits, haunting the living with unfulfilled desire. In Greek myth, the Lamia was a female demon who devoured children and seduced men. In Slavic folklore, the Rusalka was a female spirit who lured men to their deaths in rivers. These figures share with the brides the combination of beauty and danger, seduction and death. Stoker may not have drawn directly from these traditions, but the resonance is unmistakable. The vampire bride is part of a long lineage of supernatural women who embody male fears of female power and desire. Their presence also expands the scope of Dracula's power. He is not solitary. He has companions, a household, a harem of the undead. This detail emphasizes his role not only as predator, but as patriarch, a master who controls not just victims, but followers. The brides make the castle feel more inhabited, more alive, or rather more undead. They show that Dracula's influence is not limited to himself. He can reproduce, multiply, spread his corruption to others. In this sense, they foreshadow the wider contagion he will unleash when he travels to England. The fascination with the brides has only grown in later adaptations. Films, stage plays, and television series often linger on them, sometimes expanding their roles, sometimes emphasizing their erotic allure. They have become icons in their own right, symbols of vampiric femininity. Some portrayals cast them as tragic figures, women enslaved by Dracula's will. Others present them as willing accomplices, reveling in their predation. In either case, they continue to embody the tension between desire and fear, attraction and repulsion. At their core, the brides remind us that the vampire is never only about death. It is always about life, hunger, and the crossing of boundaries. The bite is a wound, but it is also an embrace. It is violence, but it is also intimacy. In the figure of the brides, this duality is made explicit, placed in the bodies of women who embody the very things Victorian society feared and desired most. When we trace the path from these brides to Lucy and Mina, we see the broader theme at work. Dracula is not only a predator of blood, but of gender norms. He destabilizes the categories of male and female, purity and corruption, control and desire. His brides are the living, or undead, proof of what happens when repression fails, when desire breaks free, when the angel in the house becomes something far darker. And yet, even as the novel condemns them, it cannot let them go. They remain in the imagination long after the details of contracts, timetables, and geography fade. Their beauty and danger haunt the reader, just as they haunted Harker. They are the shadows that linger at the edge of the narrative, reminders that the vampire's power is not only in his teeth, but in the desires he awakens. From here, the story leads us toward the symbols that were marshaled to resist them. If the brides and Lucy embody the terror of female sexuality unleashed, then the crucifixes, garlic, and consecrated wafers embody the forces of restraint, the spiritual and cultural weapons used to contain what threatened to spill beyond its boundaries. To understand Dracula fully, we must now turn to these objects, these emblems of faith and tradition, and see how they became the barriers between the living and the undead. When Jonathan Harker finds himself in the castle, surrounded by locked doors and predatory brides, his greatest defense does not come from weapons of iron or reason, but from the simplest of objects, a crucifix placed around his neck by a peasant woman before he set out on his journey. It is a reminder that in Stoker's world, faith is not ornamental, but protective, a shield against the predatory embrace of the vampire. Throughout the novel, crucifixes, garlic, holy wafers, and sacred ground act as barriers, symbols of divine authority that the undead cannot cross. Dracula is not merely a monster of folklore or a predator of nature. He is, in a profound sense, an inversion of Christianity, a blasphemous figure whose existence depends on violating the sacred. The crucifix is the most obvious emblem. Its power is absolute in the face of the vampire. When Harker brandishes it, Dracula recoils, his predatory confidence broken by a small symbol of the faith he cannot endure. The crucifix does not wound physically like a stake, nor does it bind like a coffin filled with native soil. Its power is symbolic, spiritual, rooted in the idea that Dracula's corruption cannot withstand the sign of Christ's sacrifice. This dynamic situates the vampire not simply as an enemy of the living, but as an enemy of God, a figure whose very existence is defined by its rejection of the sacred order. In a society that was increasingly grappling with scientific modernity, the crucifix carried a special resonance. By the 1890s, religion in Britain was under pressure from Darwinian evolution, biblical criticism, and the secularizing forces of industrial modernity. Stoker's use of the crucifix as an unambiguous source of power reflects both nostalgia for and assertion of the necessity of faith. Against Dracula, microscopes, telegrams, and typewriters falter. It is the crucifix, a relic of pre-modern belief, that proves indispensable. This sends a clear message. Reason and technology alone cannot combat ultimate evil. Something older, deeper, rooted in faith must be invoked. Alongside the crucifix, garlic appears again and again as a protective measure. Van Helsing prescribes it for Lucy, filling her room with flowers and wreathing her neck with blossoms. To modern readers, garlic may seem a quaint superstition, but in Eastern European folklore, it was one of the most potent apotropaic plants, used to ward off evil spirits, witches, and revenants. Its pungent smell, its strong presence, and its association with purity made it a natural barrier. Stoker did not invent this detail. He borrowed it directly from the folklore that had so fascinated him. By including it, he tied his story back to the soil of superstition, reminding readers that even in the heart of London, ancient protections mattered. Holy wafers, consecrated in the Mass, are also given extraordinary power in the novel. Van Helsing uses them to seal coffins, preventing Dracula from returning to them, and to sanctify doorways, barring his entry. In one memorable moment, Mina, who has been marked by the vampire's bite, recoils in pain when Van Helsing attempts to place a wafer on her forehead. The contact leaves a scar, an unhealed wound that marks her as corrupted. This moment is significant not only for its horror, but for its theological weight. It suggests that Dracula's bite is not merely physical but spiritual, a contamination that cannot coexist with holiness. The wafer reveals the truth of her condition in a way no medical instrument could. The coffin, too, becomes a central symbol. It is not merely a resting place, but a vessel of survival. Dracula must return to his coffin, filled with native soil, a dependence that ties him inexorably to his homeland. The image of the vampire resting in his coffin reverses the Christian association of the tomb. In Christian belief, the tomb is empty because of resurrection, a symbol of triumph over death. In Dracula's case, the coffin is not empty, but occupied by a creature who perverts resurrection, turning eternal life into undeath. The coffin becomes a parody of the tomb, a grotesque inversion of the promise of salvation. This inversion of Christian symbols permeates the novel. Where Christ offers his blood as salvation, Dracula takes blood as sustenance. Where Christian communion brings life through the body and blood of Christ, Dracula's feeding brings death and corruption through the body and blood of his victims. The parallels are too precise to ignore. Stoker's vampire is a blasphemous reflection of Christianity, a perverse communion that replaces grace with predation. Every symbol of the faith, the crucifix, the wafer, the sacrament, is placed in opposition to him, underscoring that he is not simply unnatural but unholy. This dynamic also speaks to Victorian anxieties about the erosion of faith. As modern science and skepticism grew, there was a lingering fear that without religion, society would be vulnerable to forces it could not understand or control. Dracula embodies this fear. He represents a world where superstition proves true, where evil is not metaphorical but literal, and where only the old symbols of faith can hold it back. In this sense, the novel is both a Gothic tale and a defense of Christian belief, dramatizing the necessity of faith in a world that seemed increasingly secular. It is also worth noting that the crucifix and wafers are wielded primarily by Van Helsing, the Dutch doctor whose role is both scientific and spiritual. He is a man of medicine, familiar with transfusions and pathology, but he also insists on the necessity of holy symbols. His character embodies the fusion of modern science and ancient faith, a combination Stoker presents as essential. Dracula cannot be defeated by one or the other alone. The crucifix and the coffin remind us that the battle against him is not only medical but spiritual, not only rational but sacred. The reliance on sacred symbols also reflects the structure of the novel itself. It is an epistolary text, built from letters, diaries, and documents. This structure emphasizes evidence, testimony, and rational inquiry. Yet within this structure, the most decisive tools are not rational but symbolic. The contrast is deliberate. The novel mimics the accumulation of data, the rational investigation of a supernatural case, but it resolves only through the invocation of symbols that belong to faith. This tension between rationality and religion lies at the heart of the story, and the crucifix is its clearest expression. Cultural context deepens this symbolism. In late Victorian England, Catholic symbols like the crucifix and consecrated wafer carried particular weight. For Protestant readers, they were not everyday objects, but markers of ritual, mystery, and tradition, often associated with Catholicism. By giving them power in the fight against Dracula, Stoker evoked the aura of the old church, with its incense, relics, and sacraments. The vampire could not be fought with Protestant rationalism alone. He required the weight of the older, more sacramental tradition. This may have added to the exoticism of the tale, reinforcing the sense that Dracula himself came from a land outside the familiar boundaries of modern Protestant England. The coffin, too, plays on anxieties about burial and death that were acute in the 19th century. The fear of premature burial was widespread, with stories of people waking in their coffins or being discovered scratched and bloodied inside their tombs. Advances in medical science had not eliminated the uncertainty of death, and the coffin remained a site of anxiety. By tying Dracula to his coffin, Stoker tapped into this fear, making the coffin not a place of rest, but a place of horror. It became not the end of life, but the continuation of something worse. The crucifix and the coffin, then, stand as the two poles of the novel's symbolic universe. The crucifix represents faith, protection, and the sacred order. The coffin represents corruption, inversion, and the perverse survival of undeath. Between them, the battle of the novel is staged. The characters who wield the crucifix fight to restore order. Dracula, who rises from the coffin, embodies the threat to that order. The struggle is not only physical but symbolic, a war of signs as much as of bodies. This symbolic dimension is part of what gives Dracula its endurance. The crucifix and coffin are not just props in a Gothic tale. They are emblems that resonate with deeper cultural and spiritual meanings. They remind readers that the vampire is never only a creature of blood and fang, he is also a figure of blasphemy, a shadow cast against the light of faith. From these symbols, the narrative moves outward. Dracula does not remain confined to coffins in Transylvania or crucifixes in mountain villages. He journeys to London, carrying with him his boxes of earth, attempting to transplant his corruption into the heart of the modern city. To follow him, there is to see how the geography of fear shifts, how maps themselves become tools of horror as the Count crosses borders and invades the very center of empire. When we think of Dracula, we often picture him enthroned in his castle or stalking the foggy streets of London. But one of the most compelling parts of Stoker's novel is the journey between these two worlds. The Count does not simply appear in England as if conjured from mist. He travels, and that travel is marked by geography, maps, borders, and logistics. Dracula is, in this sense, not only a supernatural figure, but also a migrant, a voyager who carries his soil, his heritage, and his corruption across continents. To follow his path is to see how Stoker transformed geography into a tool of terror, making the very act of travel part of the story's suspense. Jonathan Harker's initial journey to Transylvania sets the stage. Stoker carefully mapped out the route, consulting travel guides and accounts so that the path would feel authentic. Harker describes train schedules, ticket prices, and carriage rides with meticulous detail. His journey is not fantastical. It is grounded in the real geography of Europe in the 1890s. He crosses familiar lands into less familiar ones, moving eastward from the heart of modernity into what he perceives as its margins. The further he travels, the more he notes the shift in languages, costumes, and customs, until he reaches the land that Gerard had described in her book as the land beyond the forest, Transylvania. This progression is not only physical but symbolic. Stoker constructs the East as a place of superstition, folklore, and danger, in contrast to the rational, ordered West. The maps Harker carries with him are guides into this unknown, but they do not fully protect him. They tell him where the railways go, but not what waits in the forests. They show him borders, but not the creatures that cross them. In this way, the map becomes a metaphor for modern knowledge, useful but incomplete, always leaving space for the unknown. Dracula's own journey reverses this path. He leaves his ancestral land not as a tourist, but as an invader, carrying with him 50 boxes of earth from his homeland. These boxes are not simply luggage, but lifelines. Each one is a portable coffin, a fragment of Transylvania transplanted into foreign soil. The detail is crucial. Dracula cannot survive without the land of his origin. His invasion of England is not a complete abandonment of his roots, but a transplantation, a colonization. He brings his homeland with him, like a parasite carrying its nest, ensuring that wherever he goes, Transylvania follows. The logistics of this journey are described in painstaking detail in the novel. The count arranges for the boxes to be shipped down the river to the Black Sea, loaded onto a vessel, and transported across the water to Whitby on the English coast. Stoker includes shipping records, bills of lading, and eyewitness reports, constructing the movement of the vampire as though it were a real case file. This bureaucratic detail is part of what makes the novel so unsettling. Dracula does not simply materialize. He follows the channels of commerce, the arteries of empire, using the very systems of trade and transport that connected the 19th century world. The railway, the ship, the customs office, all become accomplices in his journey. The ship itself, the Demeter, becomes one of the most memorable episodes of the novel. The log records the gradual disappearance of the crew, the growing fear on board, and the realization that something is preying upon them. By the time the vessel runs aground in Whitby, its crew is gone, its captain dead at the wheel, and its cargo intact. This image, the ghost ship drifting into harbour, is one of the most striking in Gothic literature. It fuses the rational detail of maritime logs with the supernatural dread of an unseen predator. The map here is not only geographic, but narrative. The Demeter traces Dracula's passage across the sea, each coordinate marking another step in the spread of corruption. The choice of Whitby as the point of arrival was deliberate. Stoker had visited the town and been struck by its ruined abbey perched above the harbour. The abbey, a relic of monastic faith, provided a perfect Gothic backdrop for Dracula's arrival. The geography of Whitby, with its cliffs, graveyard and sea mist, became part of the story's atmosphere. Stoker's notes reveal that he studied the tides and the harbour charts to make the scene precise. The arrival of the Demeter is terrifying precisely because it is plausible. It could have happened in a real harbour, on a real night, under a real abbey. The blending of actual geography with Gothic invention gives the novel its enduring sense of reality. Once in England, the maps shift. The story becomes one of urban geography, of London's streets and suburbs. Dracula establishes himself not in the heart of the city, but in Carfax, a decaying estate near Purfleet, close to the railway and the river. The location is strategic. From Carfax, he can move easily into the city while remaining concealed in the shadows of a neglected property. The detail reflects Stoker's awareness of London's sprawl in the late 19th century. The way the city extended into suburbs that were neither fully urban nor fully rural. In this liminal space, Dracula could thrive, hiding in plain sight. The characters themselves become cartographers in their attempt to track him. Mina, in particular, compiles notes, organizes information, and traces movements on maps. The group charts the locations of the boxes of earth, trying to intercept and destroy them before Dracula can use them. The novel thus becomes not only a tale of pursuit, but a tale of mapping, where geography is weaponized in the battle against the vampire. Each map, each record, each piece of evidence is part of the struggle to turn Dracula's fluid supernatural movements into something knowable and traceable. The use of maps also reflects broader anxieties of the empire. Britain in the 1890s was a global power, its maps covering the world in imperial red. But those same maps carried anxieties of invasion, contamination, and reverse colonization. Dracula's journey from Transylvania to London can be read as a reversal of imperial logic. Instead of Britain projecting power outward, a force from the margins projects power inward, invading the heart of the empire. The shipping routes, railways, and harbours that sustained Britain's global dominance become the very channels through which its enemy enters. Geography becomes a weapon turned against itself. The emphasis on movement also ties Dracula to the idea of contagion. Like a disease, he travels from body to body, from soil to soil, spreading corruption as he goes. The maps of his journey are like the maps of epidemics, tracing the spread of infection from its source to its outbreak. In an age when cholera and tuberculosis haunted public imagination, this metaphor would have been powerful. Dracula is not only a predator, but a contagion, his journey across Europe mirroring the spread of invisible threats that no border could contain. In this way, maps in the novel are more than background detail. They are instruments of terror, showing how modern systems of travel, commerce, and empire can be turned into pathways for the uncanny. The rational lines of railway timetables and shipping charts are infiltrated by something that cannot be rationalized. The Demeter's logbook becomes a horror story. Mina's maps become battle plans in a war against a predator who refuses to stay fixed. Geography itself becomes unstable, haunted by a figure who moves across it like a shadow. From the mountains of Transylvania to the harbour of Whitby, from the estate at Carfax to the streets of London, Dracula's journey is a map of inversion. It inverts east and west, civilization and wilderness, centre and periphery. It turns the empire inside out, making its heart vulnerable to what it imagines as its margins. The terror lies not only in Dracula himself, but in the realization that the very systems meant to secure modern life, maps, timetables, shipping routes, can be the conduits of its undoing. By tracing these maps, Stoker gave his novel a sense of movement, scale, and inevitability. Dracula is not confined to a single place. He moves, spreads, and invades. His journey is the story of fear itself. Fear that travels, fear that crosses borders, fear that cannot be contained. To follow his path is to see how terror is mapped, how it spreads from one point to another until it seems to cover the entire world. From here, the narrative moves inward, from geography to psychology. For if Dracula's journey maps the spread of terror across space, his influence also maps the spread of terror within the mind. To understand the full power of the vampire, we must turn from the external world of maps and borders to the internal world of symbols, dreams, and archetypes, where Freud and Jung found in figures like Dracula the shadows of our deepest fears. When we follow Dracula's journey across borders, we can trace his movement on maps through timetables, ships, and train routes. But just as important is the map that cannot be drawn on paper, the map of the human mind. Stoker's Count is not only a geographical invader, but a psychological one. A figure who seeps into dreams, desires, and fears. Long after the novel was published, psychoanalysts like Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung gave language to what Dracula embodies: the return of the repressed, the eruption of shadow, the archetype of the predator hidden within the self. Even if Stoker never read their works, indeed, much of Freud's theory was still in its early development when Dracula appeared. The novel anticipates many of their ideas. To look at Dracula through psychology is to see that he is not only a monster outside us, but one inside us, a mirror of unconscious drives that both fascinate and terrify. Freud's work on repression and the unconscious provides a powerful lens. For Freud, civilization was built on repression, the containment of primal desires, especially those surrounding sex and death. But repression is never complete. What is pushed down into the unconscious always returns, disguised in dreams, slips of the tongue, or neuroses. Dracula can be read as this return made flesh. He is desire unbound, lust and hunger erupting into the ordered world of Victorian rationality. His bite, at once violent and erotic, collapses the very boundaries repression tries to maintain. When Lucy, after being bitten, becomes sexually aggressive, seeking out children and luring men, she is not merely a victim of Dracula. She is a figure of what repression fears most: female sexuality unleashed, the angel in the house transformed into a predator. The imagery of blood deepens this reading. Blood is not only life in the novel, but also a thinly veiled metaphor for sexuality. The exchange of blood mirrors intercourse, mingling bodies in a way both intimate and invasive. Freud's theory of the uncanny, the unheimlich, also resonates here. The uncanny arises when something familiar becomes strange, when what should be hidden comes to light. The vampire bite is uncanny precisely because it transforms an act of intimacy into an act of horror, something at once recognizable and terrifyingly alien. Dracula himself embodies the uncanny, a nobleman with manners and speech who, beneath the surface, is something utterly inhuman. Jung's framework adds another layer. For Jung, myths and symbols were expressions of archetypes, primordial images lodged in the collective unconscious. Dracula is one of these archetypes, the shadow, the dark double of humanity, representing everything we deny in ourselves but cannot destroy. The shadow is not evil for its own sake. It is the accumulation of what society rejects, the primal drive civilization represses. Dracula fits this perfectly. He is the shadow of Victorian England, embodying its repressed sexuality, its fear of the foreign, its dread of death. He cannot be killed easily because he is part of the psyche itself. To confront him is to confront the shadow within. The vampire's immortality also aligns with Jung's archetypal framework. Vampires never die because the fears and desires they represent never die. They recur in every age, in new forms, because repression is never permanent. The vampire is an archetype of recurrence, surfacing whenever a culture needs a figure to embody its anxieties. In Stoker's time, that anxiety was about sexuality, degeneration, and invasion. In later times, the vampire would shift to embody consumerism, addiction, or disease. Jung would say this adaptability is what makes the vampire archetype so powerful. It draws from the deepest layer of human psychology, where symbols shift, but the underlying fears remain. Dreams in the novel reinforce these psychological readings. Characters often experience Dracula in dreamlike states. Lucy sleepwalks. Mina feels his presence as a kind of trance, and Harker describes his encounters with the brides as both waking and dream. These dreamlike qualities mirror the unconscious, where boundaries blur and desires reveal themselves in disguised form. Dracula does not only attack bodies, he invades minds. His presence is psychic as well as physical, an archetypal invader slipping past conscious defenses into the realm of dream and desire. There is also a Freudian dimension to the imagery of penetration. The stake, driven into the vampire's heart, is not only a weapon, but a symbolic reversal of the vampire's own penetrative act. In Lucy's destruction, the scene is described with unsettling erotic detail, as though the men who loved her are reclaiming her through an act that is as much sexual as it is violent. Freud would not have missed the undertones. The fear of the vampire is bound up with the fear of uncontrolled sexuality, and the solution, staking, beheading, burning, is framed as both purification and symbolic reassertion of patriarchal control. At the same time, Jung would remind us that destruction of the shadow does not mean its eradication. The shadow cannot be destroyed. It can only be integrated. Dracula may be killed at the end of the novel, but his archetype survives, resurfacing in countless adaptations and retellings. This is because he represents something that cannot be eliminated from the human psyche: the pull of desire, the fascination with death, the attraction to what is forbidden. Each new Dracula is not simply a retelling of a story, but a return of the archetype, adapted to the anxieties of its time. The psychology of Dracula also resonates with Victorian anxieties about degeneration, a concept drawn from contemporary science. Thinkers like Max Nordau warned that civilization was in decline, that overindulgence and decadence were weakening the human race. Dracula embodies this fear of degeneration. He is both ancient and decayed, powerful yet parasitic. His victims weaken, pale and waste away, mirroring the rhetoric of social decline. The vampire becomes a metaphor for the fear that modern society was being drained of vitality by hidden forces. In psychological terms, this is projection, society locating its own anxieties about weakness and corruption in an external figure. Dracula is not only the invader, but the externalization of internal decay. Another psychological dimension lies in Dracula's need for invitation. He cannot enter a home unless invited. On one level, this is folklore. On another, it is psychological truth. The shadow can only act when given space in the psyche. Repression creates vulnerability. When boundaries weaken, when desire overrides caution, the vampire enters. This rule encapsulates the paradox of repression. What we fear most is often what we secretly invite. Harker does not physically invite the brides, but his unconscious desire does. Lucy does not consciously invite Dracula, but her openness to the night makes her vulnerable. The vampire enters where repression has already failed. The archetype of Dracula also speaks to the fear of the double. Freud's essay on the uncanny links the double with both death and immortality, something both reassuring and terrifying. Dracula is Harker's double in the sense that he is a man of manners and speech, yet also a beast. He is Mina's double in her trance states, Lucy's double in her transformation. He is everyone's double in the sense that he embodies what they repress. The vampire as double is terrifying because it reveals the continuity between self and other, between civilized and monstrous. Psychology also explains why Dracula is so enduring. He is not bound to a single interpretation because the unconscious is not bound to a single fear. For Freud, he is repressed sexuality. For Jung, he is the shadow archetype. For modern psychology, he might be addiction, compulsion, or trauma. Each reading is valid because each draws from the same symbolic core. The vampire is a psychic shapeshifter, just as he is a literal one, embodying whatever the unconscious projects onto him. This psychological lens also reframes the heroes of the novel. Van Helsing, Seward, and Harker are not only battling a supernatural foe, they are battling the eruption of unconscious drives. Their tools, faith, reason, maps, journals, are ways of containing the uncontainable. Mina, with her orderly notes and devotion, becomes the counterpoint to the chaos Dracula represents. But even she is touched by him, scarred on her forehead by the holy wafer, marked as one who has been invaded by the unconscious. The victory at the end is less about destruction than about containment, an attempt to repress once more what has already surfaced. When Freud and Jung offered their theories, they gave language to what Stoker had dramatized. The vampire is the return of the repressed, the eruption of the shadow, the archetype of forbidden desire. This is why Dracula resonates not only as a story, but as a psychological myth. It is not only about a man from Transylvania invading London. It is about the unconscious invading consciousness, the shadow breaking into the ordered world of reason. From psychology, the story widens again, moving from the mind of the individual to the structures of society. For Dracula is not only an archetype of the unconscious, he is also a figure of the other, the outsider, whose presence threatens to contaminate the purity of nation, race, and class. To understand his full power, we must move from the psychology of the individual to the anxieties of the collective, where race, empire, and social order define the vampire as much as dream and desire. If Dracula can be read as the shadow of the unconscious, he can also be read as the shadow of society itself. Every age projects its fears onto outsiders, and in the late Victorian world, anxieties about race, class, empire, and a generation loomed as large as personal repression. Dracula is not only a predator of individuals, but a figure of the other, the stranger who crosses borders and contaminates the familiar. His foreignness, his aristocracy, his parasitic hunger, all reflect Victorian unease about a rapidly changing world. To unmask him in this light is to see him not just as a monster of psychology, but as a monster of culture. From the very beginning, Stoker marks Dracula as foreign. Jonathan Harker describes the villagers he meets on his way to the castle in ways that emphasize their difference: strange languages, superstitions, and costumes. By the time he arrives at Dracula's door, he has been primed to see the Count not only as an individual, but as the embodiment of a foreign land. Dracula's appearance reinforces this impression. His face is described as aquiline, his skin pale, his hands hairy and grasping. He is at once aristocratic and bestial, a composite of traits that seemed exotic to Victorian eyes. In this way, he becomes a racialized figure, a body onto which anxieties about the East, the foreign, and the uncivilized are projected. The late 19th century was obsessed with the concept of reverse colonization. The British Empire prided itself on expanding outward, civilizing what it saw as savage lands. But beneath this confidence lay a fear that the traffic might not be one way, that the colonized might return the gaze, invade the center, and contaminate the purity of the empire. Dracula embodies this fear perfectly. He leaves his remote eastern castle and establishes himself in London, the heart of imperial power. He uses the very channels of commerce and transport that sustain the empire, ships, railways, ports, to bring his corruption into its core. He is the nightmare of empire turned inside out. Race played a key role in this anxiety. The Victorians categorized peoples into hierarchies, with Anglo-Saxon Englishness imagined as the pinnacle of civilization. But immigration, urbanization, and the presence of foreign communities in London created unease. Dracula, with his strange speech, his foreign customs, and his parasitic appetite, reflects the fear of racial contamination. His ability to blend in, to purchase property, and move among the English mirrors the fear that outsiders could infiltrate and undermine the nation from within. The vampire's bite, becomes a metaphor for miscegenation, the mingling of blood that Victorians often framed in terms of corruption and degeneration. Class anxiety is just as present. Dracula is an aristocrat, a count with a lineage that stretches back centuries, yet his aristocracy is not benevolent. It is parasitic. He feeds on the vitality of the living, just as critics of the landed nobility accuse them of feeding on the labor of the poor. In this sense, Dracula embodies the fear of a decayed aristocracy lingering into the modern world, draining society without contributing to it. The image of the vampire as aristocrat was already present in Polidori's Lord Ruthven, but Stoker sharpened it, making the connection between parasitism and privilege undeniable. The Count's castle is not a place of culture but a tomb. His lineage is not noble but corrupt. His aristocracy is a mask for predation. At the same time, Dracula also embodies anxieties about the lower classes. He can command swarms of rats, fill the streets with vermin, and summon the howling of wolves. These associations tie him to the imagery of slums and disease, the fear that poverty and overcrowding in cities bred corruption that could spread like an epidemic. The vampire thus collapses class fears into a single figure. He is both the parasitic aristocrat and the contaminating poor, feeding from above and below. In this doubleness lies his power as a symbol. He can embody whatever form of class anxiety the reader projects. Degeneration theory added another layer to these fears. Thinkers like Cesare Lombroso and Max Nordau argued that modern society was in decline, that crime, immorality, and weakness were signs of a species sliding backward into primitiveness. They often linked this degeneration to the influence of foreigners, the poor, and the unrestrained. Dracula fits perfectly into this framework. He is ancient, yet primitive, powerful, yet decayed. His body shows signs of atavism, hairy palms, sharp teeth, bestial features, marks of what degeneration theorists described as the throwback to earlier, less civilized stages of evolution. His victims, once bitten, waste away, their vitality drained, their morality corroded. Lucy becomes promiscuous and predatory. Mina becomes marked and scarred. Dracula is not only a predator, but a contaminant, spreading degeneration wherever he goes. The imagery of disease reinforces this reading. The vampire's bite is described in terms that echo infection, pale skin, weakness, fever, wasting away. Blood transfusions are attempted as cures, echoing contemporary medical practices. The fear of syphilis, a disease associated with sexuality and contamination, hangs in the background. To be bitten by Dracula is not only to lose blood, but to be infected, to be transformed into something corrupt. This is why the battle against him is framed not only as a fight, but as a quarantine, a desperate attempt to contain the spread before it overwhelms society. Gender intersects with these anxieties in crucial ways. Lucy's transformation into a predatory woman embodies the fear that class and racial contamination could spread through sexuality. Her once pure English body becomes a vessel of foreign corruption, a site of degeneracy. Mina, though spared full transformation, is scarred and marked, a reminder that no one is immune. In Victorian logic, women were often framed as the keepers of purity, the guardians of the home and the nation. To have them invaded, bitten, and transformed was to threaten the very fabric of society. Dracula's predation is thus not only personal, but national, an assault on the purity of England itself. The response to Dracula reflects these anxieties. The group that opposes him, Harker, Van Helsing, Seward, Holmwood, and Morris, represents the Victorian ideal of rational, masculine authority. They are professional men, lawyers, doctors, aristocrats, armed with science, faith, and reason. Their unity across national lines, Dutch, American, English, reflects the alliance of the West against the foreign invader. Their tools, maps, documents, crucifixes, knives, represent the arsenal of civilization. The destruction of Dracula is staged as a reaffirmation of social order, a reassertion of boundaries that his presence threatened to dissolve. But the novel's fascination with Dracula complicates this victory. For all the effort to destroy him, the Count remains the most compelling figure in the story. He is more vivid than the men who oppose him, more magnetic than the virtues they represent. This tension reflects the ambivalence of Victorian attitudes toward the other. Dracula is feared, but he is also alluring. He embodies anxieties about race, class, and degeneration, but he also embodies a secret fascination with transgression. The very thing society condemns is also what it cannot stop imagining. This ambivalence explains why Dracula has endured beyond the anxieties of his age. Later generations would read him through new lenses. In the 20th century, he became a figure of capitalist exploitation, draining workers like a parasite. In other contexts, he was linked to fears of communism, spreading contagion across borders. In yet others, he became a metaphor for immigration, addiction, or even consumer culture. Each age projects its fears onto him, because he is already constructed as the other, the vessel for whatever anxieties a society wishes to confront and disavow. In Stoker's time, however, the fears were specific. The vampire was not only a Gothic villain, but a symbol of Victorian anxiety, about foreignness, about class, about degeneration, about purity threatened by contamination. Dracula is the embodiment of these fears, a figure who makes them tangible in the body of a single, unforgettable predator. From this social and cultural lens, the story moves outward once again, into the realm of adaptation and reinvention. For Dracula did not remain confined to Stoker's pages. His foreignness, his aristocracy, his predation, these qualities were soon reimagined on the stage and screen, where he would become not only a figure of Victorian anxiety, but a global icon, his image shifting with each new performance. When Bram Stoker died in 1912, his most ambitious novel had been in print for 15 years, selling modestly, but without the sensational impact of a runaway bestseller. Dracula had been received as a strong entry in the tradition of Gothic fiction, praised for its atmosphere and suspense, but it was not yet the global phenomenon it would become. The Count's immortality, in a cultural sense, came not from the page alone, but from the stage and screen. The transformation of Dracula into one of the most recognizable figures in modern mythology happened through performance, through actors and filmmakers who gave him a body, a voice, and a face that audiences could not forget. To trace this transformation is to see how a literary villain became a cultural icon. The first steps came on the stage. Stoker himself had dramatized Dracula shortly after the novel's publication, producing a minimal stage version in 1897 to secure dramatic rights. This version was not a success, performed only once in a hastily arranged production, but it planted a seed. Theatrical adaptations of Gothic novels were already popular, and Dracula's story, with its castle, its brides, its shipwreck, and its confrontations, was ripe for performance. Over the next 2 decades, the Count began to find his way into theatrical retellings, often streamlined to emphasize his role as a mysterious aristocrat. The most influential stage adaptation came in the 1920s, written by Hamilton Deane in England. Deane reimagined Dracula not as a decayed old man with hairy palms and grotesque features, but as a suave, tuxedo-clad figure who could walk into a drawing room and charm his victims. This image, dark evening clothes, slicked hair, aristocratic poise, was a radical departure from Stoker's description, but it proved irresistible. It fit the aesthetics of the theatre, where elegance and presence mattered as much as terror. Dean's version toured England successfully and was later revised by John L. Balderston for Broadway in 1927. It was on this Broadway stage that Bela Lugosi first donned the cloak. His performance electrified audiences. He played Dracula not as a monster lurking in shadows, but as a hypnotic foreign aristocrat whose every gesture exuded control. His heavy accent, a product of his Hungarian origin, added to the exotic aura. His gaze, his pauses, his deliberate movements turned the vampire into a figure of fascination as well as fear. Audiences found themselves enthralled by the Count, even as they recoiled from him. Lugosi's Dracula was not simply a villain. He was a presence, a magnetism that redefined the character for generations. The success of the play attracted Hollywood, and in 1931, Universal Pictures released Dracula, directed by Todd Browning and starring Lugosi in the role he had perfected. This film was not the first vampire movie. F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu, 1922, had already terrified audiences with its gaunt, rat-like Count Orlok, but it was the first official adaptation of Stoker's novel. Universal's Dracula crystallized the image of the vampire in popular imagination. Lugosi, with his slick hair, cape, and piercing eyes, became the definitive Count. His slow, deliberate speech, his aristocratic bearing, and his hypnotic stare set the template that countless imitations would follow. The impact of this film cannot be overstated. At a time when sound was still new to cinema, Lugosi's voice became iconic. "I am Dracula," he intoned, and the words carried not only menace, but allure. The cape became an inseparable part of the character, a symbol of both aristocracy and supernatural concealment. The camera lingered on Lugosi's face as he leaned towards his victims, suggesting more than showing, leaving the horror partly to the imagination. The film's sets, shadowy castles, misty graveyards, and decadent drawing rooms extended the Gothic atmosphere. Though it simplified Stoker's novel, removing characters and condensing the plot, it established Dracula as a cinematic archetype. In the decades that followed, Universal produced a series of Dracula films, often featuring Lugosi or other actors in the role. These films increasingly leaned into formula, but they solidified the vampire as part of Hollywood's pantheon of monsters, alongside Frankenstein's creature, the Mummy, and the Wolfman. Dracula became not only a character, but a franchise, his image reproduced in posters, merchandise, and Halloween costumes. He was no longer confined to Gothic literature. He was a household figure, recognizable even to those who had never read Stoker's novel. But Dracula was not static. Each new era reshaped him. In the 1950s and 1960s, Hammer Films in Britain reinvented the character for a new generation. Played by Christopher Lee, Dracula shed some of Lugosi's aristocratic restraint and became more physical, more overtly sexual. Lee's towering presence, combined with the crimson blood that Hammer delighted in showing, turned the Count into a figure of both horror and desire. His Dracula was violent, feral, but also magnetic. Hammer's films emphasized the erotic undertones of the vampire, showing women in low-cut gowns swooning under his bite, a reflection of changing cultural attitudes towards sexuality. In this era, Dracula became not only a predator, but a symbol of transgressive desire. Other actors added their own interpretations. Frank Langella played Dracula on stage and screen in the 1970s, emphasizing his romantic allure. Gary Oldman, in Francis Ford Coppola's 1992 Bram Stoker's Dracula, gave the Count a tragic dimension, portraying him as a man cursed by love, whose vampirism was born from grief and defiance of God. This interpretation leaned into the Gothic tradition of the Byronic hero, blending monstrosity with passion. The result was a Dracula who was not simply feared, but pitied, a figure of doomed romance as much as horror. Parody also played a role in cementing Dracula's cultural presence. From Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein to Mel Brooks's Dracula, dead and loving, the Count was spoofed, satirized, and turned into comedy. Children's cartoons presented him as a friendly figure, teaching the alphabet on Sesame Street as Count von Count. Each parody reinforced his image, making him even more ubiquitous. The fact that he could be both terrifying and laughable only deepened his cultural reach. As cinema expanded globally, so too did Dracula. In Japan, anime reimagined him in fantastical forms. In Mexico, luchador films pitted masked wrestlers against vampire counts. In the Soviet Union, filmmakers produced their own Gothic versions. Each culture adapted Dracula to its own anxieties and aesthetics, proving the character's malleability. He was never tied to one form. Like the shapeshifter he is, he adapted, surviving every reinterpretation. The stage also continued to reimagine him. Ballets, operas, and musicals have all given Dracula new life. In each medium, his story shifts to fit the form. On the ballet stage, he becomes a figure of physical grace, his bite translated into pas de deux. In opera, his voice soars as an expression of passion and doom. In musicals, his charisma dominates, blending horror with spectacle. Each adaptation highlights a different facet of the character, showing that he can be endlessly refracted. The Count's transformation on screen also mirrored social change. In the 1970s and 1980s, amid the sexual revolution and the AIDS crisis, Dracula was often linked to fears of disease, contagion, and dangerous desire. In more recent times, he has been reimagined in the context of consumer culture, as a metaphor for addiction or capitalism, feeding endlessly and insatiably. In some versions, he is the villain. In others, he is the anti-hero, a figure of rebellion against conformity. In all cases, he remains relevant because he embodies whatever fears and desires the age projects onto him. What makes Dracula unique among Gothic monsters is this adaptability. Frankenstein's creature, the mummy, the wolfman, these figures have endured, but none with the same ubiquity. Dracula is endlessly renewable, endlessly present, because his essence is simple yet expansive. A predator who feeds on life, a foreign aristocrat, a figure of allure and dread. Stage and screen gave him faces and voices that could shift with time. Lugosi's aristocratic hypnotist, Lee's violent seducer, Oldman's tragic lover, Langella's romantic hero, all are Dracula, and yet each is different. The Count survives not by staying the same, but by changing, by taking on new guises as surely as he takes the form of bat or wolf. By the end of the 20th century, Dracula was no longer just a literary figure, but a cultural institution. His cape, his fangs, his accent, his castle, these were symbols known across the globe. He had become both terrifying and familiar, both ancient and modern. On stage and screen, he had transformed from Stoker's creation into a shared myth, one that could be endlessly retold. From here, the story of Dracula's cultural afterlife expands further. For alongside Lugosi's aristocrat and Lee's seducer, another figure had risen in parallel, a rival who carried the same folklore but a very different face. To understand how Dracula became the vampire we know today, we must consider the shadow cast by Nosferatu, the unauthorized copy that became his most enduring competitor, shaping his image even as it stole from him. When audiences think of Dracula today, they often picture Bela Lugosi's piercing stare or Christopher Lee's crimson-smeared lips. Yet standing beside these elegant aristocrats is another vampire, one far less refined, but perhaps even more haunting. This is Count Orlok of F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu, 1922, the bald, rat-faced creature who moves with jerky menace through expressionist shadows. Orlok was never meant to exist. He was born of theft, an unauthorized adaptation of Dracula, created without permission from Stoker's estate. Yet this rival, shaped by accident and legal conflict, became one of the most influential vampire images in history. To understand the full legacy of Dracula, we must trace the shadow of Nosferatu, the film that nearly disappeared, but instead defined the vampire for generations. The story begins with the German film company Prana Film, founded in 1921 with the intent of producing occult and supernatural movies. Stoker's Dracula seemed the perfect choice for adaptation, but securing the rights proved impossible. Stoker had died in 1912, and his widow, Florence Stoker, fiercely guarded his work. Rather than abandon the project, Prana Film pressed ahead, thinly disguising the story. Dracula became Count Orlok. Jonathan Harker became Thomas Hutter. Mina became Ellen. Transylvania was renamed, and London was replaced with Wisborg, a fictional German town. The skeleton of the story remained intact. A young man journeys to a foreign land, encounters a vampire, and brings the contagion back home. Murnau's decision to alter Dracula's appearance was radical. Instead of an aristocrat in evening clothes, Orlok is grotesque, bald, pale, with pointed ears, claw-like hands, and rodent-like teeth. He is more plague-bearer than seducer, a walking embodiment of pestilence. Where Lugosi would later glide with hypnotic elegance, Orlok shuffles and looms, his body elongated by harsh angles and unnatural shadows. He does not charm his victims, he terrifies them. This transformation reflected the anxieties of Weimar Germany, where the trauma of World War I and the devastation of the Spanish flu pandemic still haunted the population. Orlok is less a foreign aristocrat than a disease incarnate, creeping silently into homes and draining life without seduction or mercy. The film's imagery amplifies this association with plague. Orlok arrives not on the Demeter, but on a ship infested with rats, symbols of disease and decay. The townspeople die in droves, coffins piling up in the streets, funeral processions winding endlessly through Wisborg. The vampire here is not a lone predator, but an epidemic, his presence marked by communal collapse rather than private seduction. The interwar audience, still reeling from influenza that had killed millions, would have recognized the resonance immediately. Orlok was not simply a gothic monster. He was the embodiment of invisible contagion made visible. Expressionist cinema gave Orlok a visual world suited to his strangeness. The distorted sets, the sharp contrasts of light and shadow, the unnatural movements, all created an atmosphere of dream and nightmare. Orlok's famous silhouette climbing the staircase, his elongated fingers reaching toward Ellen's bedroom, became one of the most iconic images in cinema. Unlike Lugosi's Dracula, who thrived on presence and charisma, Orlok thrived on absence and shadow. He was often glimpsed indirectly, his shadow on a wall, his figure through a doorway, making him more terrifying by suggestion than by direct confrontation. Florence Stoker, however, was not impressed. She sued Prana Film for copyright infringement, and the courts ruled in her favor. All prints of Nosferatu were ordered destroyed. For a time, it seemed Orlok would vanish into cinematic oblivion, remembered only in legal disputes. But film, like the vampire itself, has a way of refusing death. Some prints survived, circulating quietly among collectors and later resurfacing in archives. By the mid-20th century, Nosferatu was recognized not as an act of plagiarism, but as a masterpiece of German expressionism, one of the most important horror films ever made. The survival of Nosferatu created an unusual dynamic. Dracula had two faces, the aristocratic seducer of Lugosi and the monstrous plague-bearer of Orlok. These dual images shaped the vampire's cultural legacy. Lugosi made the vampire alluring, a figure of dark romance. Orlok made the vampire repulsive, a figure of disease and decay. Every vampire story since has wrestled with these two poles. Some lean toward seduction, others toward horror. But both images trace back to this rivalry between Stoker's novel and Murnau's unauthorized copy. This duality also reflects deeper cultural anxieties. In England, at the height of empire, Dracula was imagined as a foreign aristocrat invading the metropolis. In Weimar Germany, fractured by war and disease, the vampire became a figure of pestilence, unstoppable and inhuman. The same story was adapted to reflect different national fears, showing how malleable the vampire myth could be. Orlok's grotesque body was not only a legal workaround, it was a cultural mirror reflecting a society that saw horror not in seduction, but in contagion. The rivalry between Dracula and Orlok has continued to shape popular culture. Count Orlok, once suppressed, has returned repeatedly in homage and parody. Werner Herzog's Nosferatu, the Vampire, 1979, reimagined the story with Klaus Kinski as a tragic Orlok, simultaneously monstrous and pitiful, cursed by his own hunger. Shadow of the Vampire, 2000, starring Willem Dafoe, turned the making of Nosferatu into a metafictional tale, imagining that Max Schreck, the actor who played Orlok, was himself a vampire. These adaptations reinforce the idea that Orlok was not merely a copy of Dracula, but a rival with his own mythic power. The fact that Orlok has endured despite his origins speaks to the adaptability of the vampire archetype. While Lugosi and Lee gave us Dracula as seducer, Orlok reminds us that the vampire is also a figure of pestilence, death, and decay. This tension between allure and revulsion keeps the archetype alive. Too much charm, and the vampire becomes a romantic cliché. Too much grotesque horror, and the vampire loses its fascination. Together, Dracula and Orlok balance each other, ensuring that the vampire remains both seductive and terrifying. Even the names tell the story of rivalry. Dracula became a household word, synonymous with the vampire itself. Nosferatu, though originally just a synonym Stoker had borrowed from Romanian folklore, became equally iconic, rebranded by Murnau as the title of his unauthorized film. Today, both names carry cultural weight, representing different faces of the same myth. Dracula is the aristocrat, Nosferatu is the monster. Together, they show the vampire's twofold nature. The rivalry also highlights how adaptation shapes myth more than original texts. Few people who picture Dracula imagine Stoker's description of an old man with hairy palms and bad breath. Instead, they see Lugosi or Lee. Few imagine the complex epistolary structure of the novel. Instead, they recall cinematic images. In the same way, Orlok has shaped our vision of horror even for those who never saw Nosferatu. His shadow on the staircase, his rat-like teeth, his clawed hands, These have entered cultural memory as surely as Lugosi's cape. Stoker created the Count, but it was cinema that gave him his immortal face, and Nosferatu was part of that creation, even against the wishes of his widow. Ultimately, the story of Nosferatu is itself vampiric. It stole its life from Dracula, was hunted down by legal authorities, nearly destroyed yet survived, multiplying through hidden copies and resurrected in new forms. Like the vampire it depicts, the film refused death, returning again and again to haunt new generations. Its rivalry with Stoker's Dracula is not one of replacement, but of doubling, a gothic mirror where one vampire reflects the other. Together, they ensured that the vampire would never be confined to one face, one form, or one interpretation. From here, the narrative turns to the modern age, where these rival images converge. Dracula as seducer and Nosferatu as monster both echo in the performances of later actors, from Lugosi's successors to contemporary reimaginings. To trace this lineage is to see how the Count became an immortal icon, transforming with each generation, never dying, always returning, just as eternal as the myth he embodies. By the time Nosferatu had carved its place in cinematic history, Dracula himself had already begun a long journey through popular culture, changing faces, accents, costumes, and moods with each new generation. Few fictional figures have endured as fluidly as the Count, shifting from monstrous foreign invader to suave aristocrat, from tragic lover to parody, from horror to romance to action. To follow his path from Bela Lugosi to modern adaptations is to witness not only the evolution of a character, but the way each era reinvents its monsters to reflect its own anxieties and desires. Dracula, more than any other Gothic creation, has proven himself immortal, not only in the story, but in culture itself. When Universal released Dracula in 1931 with Bela Lugosi in the role, they could not have known how deeply his performance would shape the archetype. Lugosi's Dracula was hypnotic, elegant, and unforgettable. His voice, with its rolling Hungarian accent, became the sound of the vampire for decades. His cape, lined in red, became inseparable from the image. Though Stoker had imagined a decade-old man, Lugosi turned Dracula into a figure of allure, one who could walk into a drawing room and capture attention before ever baring his fangs. The film's success spawned sequels and spin-offs, cementing Lugosi as the face of Dracula. Yet this success was also a prison for the actor, who struggled to escape the shadow of the role. Lugosi was typecast, his career defined by the Count, even as he longed for variety. His fate mirrored that of Dracula himself, immortal in memory, trapped by identity. Universal continued to mine the character throughout the 1930s and 1940s. Dracula's Daughter, 1936, Son of Dracula, 1943, and crossover films like House of Frankenstein, 1944, and Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, 1948, extended the vampire's reach. These films diluted the original menace, but they spread the image of Dracula even further. By mid-century, the Count was not only a figure of Gothic horror, but part of a shared cinematic universe, rubbing shoulders with Frankenstein's monster, the Wolfman, and the Mummy. In these roles, the Count became a brand, a recognizable face of horror as familiar as any Hollywood star. The 1950s brought a new reinvention through Hammer films in Britain. Christopher Lee's portrayal in Horror of Dracula, 1958, shocked audiences with its color, violence, and sexuality. Hammer's Dracula was more physical than Lugosi's, a towering figure whose fangs dripped with blood and whose eyes glowed with feral hunger. Where Lugosi had hypnotized, Lee pursued. His Dracula was animalistic, brutal, but also magnetic, towering over victims with both menace and allure. Hammer films reveled in blood, cleavage, and gothic excess, reflecting a loosening of censorship and a changing cultural landscape. Lee's Dracula became the face of horror for a new generation, his presence so commanding that he would reprise the role in multiple sequels. The Hammer era highlighted a shift. Dracula was no longer only a gothic villain, but also a symbol of forbidden desire. The bite became overtly erotic, the women's responses more explicit, the violence more visceral. These films played to anxieties about sexual liberation and moral decay, turning Dracula into both predator and fantasy. Christopher Lee himself often expressed ambivalence about the sequels, frustrated by thin scripts and typecasting, but his performances cemented Dracula's image in the mid-20th century as a being of both horror and attraction. The 1970s and 1980s saw further reinventions. Frank Langella's stage performance as Dracula in the 1970s, later adapted into a 1979 film, leaned heavily into romance. Langella's Count was not grotesque, but seductive, a darkly handsome figure who attracted as much as he repelled. This version reflected shifting cultural sensibilities, where audiences wanted their monsters to also be lovers, figures of tragic passion as much as danger. Around the same time, parody flourished. Mel Brooks's Dracula, Dead and Loving It, 1995, and earlier comedic takes made the Count a subject of laughter as well as fear. On television, Count von Count on Sesame Street turned the vampire into a friendly teacher of numbers, showing how deeply he had penetrated cultural imagination. Dracula could now appear in children's programming without losing his iconic power. Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula, 1992, attempted to return to the source while also amplifying the romance. Gary Oldman's portrayal gave the Count multiple forms: the decrepit old man in the castle, the feral wolf-like predator, and the tragic lover seeking reunion with his lost bride. This film emphasized the tragic dimension of Dracula, presenting his vampirism as the result of a curse born from grief and defiance of God. Oldman's Dracula was both terrifying and sympathetic, monstrous yet vulnerable. The lush visuals, operatic style, and emphasis on doomed love reframed the Count for the late 20th century, making him a figure of gothic passion as much as horror. The late 20th and early 21st centuries expanded Dracula into new genres. Action films like Blade Trinity, 2004, reinvented him as a monstrous alpha predator, while animated films like Hotel Transylvania, 2012, turned him into a comedic father figure voiced by Adam Sandler. Video games from Castlevania to Skyrim borrowed freely from his imagery, ensuring that the Count remained present in interactive culture. Dracula had become not just a character, but a symbol, appearing wherever vampires appeared, a shorthand for the archetype itself. Modern adaptations often emphasize Dracula's adaptability. In BBC's Dracula 2020, Claes Bang portrayed the Count as both charming and monstrous, self-aware and sardonic, a blend of old and new sensibilities. In Castlevania's animated series, he became a tragic anti-hero, a man whose war on humanity is fueled by grief for his murdered wife. These interpretations reflect a contemporary fascination with villains who are complex rather than one-dimensional, inviting empathy as well as fear. Dracula is no longer only the invader. He is also the wounded figure, the cursed immortal, the tragic lover. Throughout all these adaptations, one constant remains. Dracula survives. His image shifts, but he endures, feeding on the cultural bloodstream of each era. In the 1930s, he was the foreign aristocrat, hypnotic and strange. In the 1950s and 60s, he was the feral seducer, reflecting sexual anxieties. In the 1970s and 80s, he was the romantic figure, embodying passion and desire. In the 1990s and beyond, he became tragic, comedic, action-oriented, and even paternal. Each version adds to the myth, layering new meanings onto an already rich archetype. This immortality is not accidental. It reflects the fundamental nature of the vampire myth, the ability to adapt, to survive by feeding on what culture provides. Just as Dracula takes the blood of others to sustain himself, the character takes the anxieties and desires of each age, transforming them into new vitality. He is not fixed in one form but constantly reborn, just as Stoker's novel imagined him shifting from old man to predator, to bat to mist. The Count is, in every sense, a shapeshifter. From Lugosi's aristocratic gaze to Lee's feral hunger, from Oldman's tragic passion to Sandler's comedic warmth, Dracula has proven himself more than a character. He is a cultural icon, a figure who belongs not only to Gothic literature, but to global mythology. His immortality lies not only in his bite, but in his adaptability, his ability to take on the shape each era demands. From here, the story of Dracula arrives at its culmination. Having traced his journey from folklore and history, from Vlad the Impaler to Stoker's imagination, from stage to screen, from Orlok to Lugosi to Lee to modern adaptations, we arrive at the central question: why does he endure? Why, of all Gothic figures, does Dracula remain the one we cannot let go? The one we return to again and again, the one whose castle doors we always reopen? To answer this, we must look not only at history, psychology, or culture, but at the timeless fascination that keeps us walking into the shadows where he waits. For more than a century, the figure of Dracula has returned to us again and again, never vanishing, never fading, always reshaping himself in ways that match our fears and desires. His immortality is not only within the fiction of Bram Stoker's novel, but in the life of culture itself. We continue to open the door, to peer into the shadows, to let him in, despite knowing what he represents. The question then is why? Why do we still enter Dracula's castle? Why does he remain the vampire above all others, the one who has not only survived, but flourished, while countless other Gothic monsters have faded into the background? One reason lies in his sheer adaptability. Dracula is not tied to one single meaning or appearance. In Stoker's pages, he is both old man and predator, aristocrat and beast, bat, wolf and mist. On stage, he became the tuxedoed aristocrat. On screen, he became Lugosi's hypnotic figure, Lee's feral seducer, Oldman's tragic lover, Sandler's comedic patriarch. Each form is different, yet each is recognizably Dracula. This flexibility makes him an archetype, not merely a character. He can be fear, desire, disease, addiction, power, love, or loss, depending on what the age requires. Unlike other Gothic figures who remain tethered to one narrow set of meanings, Dracula absorbs new ones endlessly, ensuring that he never becomes irrelevant. Another reason is the way Dracula embodies universal human fears: death, desire, the unknown, the outsider. These are not temporary anxieties, but perennial ones. His bite fuses sex and death, intimacy and violence, in a way that speaks to the deepest layers of the psyche. His foreignness plays on the tension between self and other, us and them, inside and outside. His immortality reflects both our fear of endless existence and our longing to escape mortality. Every culture has some version of these fears, and Dracula provides a vessel through which they can be dramatized. He is the nightmare of death given life, the fantasy of immortality turned curse. the outsider we fear but also desire. We also continue to enter Dracula's castle because he invites us in with more than terror. He fascinates us. Monsters like the werewolf or the mummy may terrify, but they rarely seduce. Dracula seduces before he destroys, and that seduction is part of the appeal. We want to look into his eyes, to hear his voice, even if we know it will end badly. The vampire myth is built on this paradox. We fear the bite, but we also long for it. The act of feeding is violent, but it is also intimate. Dracula represents the forbidden embrace, the desire we repress but cannot erase. To read his story, to watch his films, to imagine his presence, is to play with that boundary between fear and longing, to step into the forbidden space without fully crossing over. Dracula also survives because he is not only an individual, but a system, a way of thinking about power. He feeds without giving back, an aristocrat draining peasants, a foreign invader draining a nation, a parasite draining vitality. He can be read as the embodiment of feudal oppression, of capitalist exploitation, of colonial invasion, of addiction. Each generation sees in him the power that consumes it. And each generation imagines defeating him, staking him through the heart, restoring order, only to find that he returns again, in a new form, demanding another confrontation. His castle is the place where we stage these battles, again and again, knowing the outcome, but compelled to repeat it. The castle itself is part of the allure. It is both fortress and prison, labyrinth and stage. In Stoker's novel, Harker's time in the castle is one of the most vivid sections, filled with locked doors, empty halls, and unseen presences. On film, the castle has become a Gothic icon. Looming spires, cobwebbed halls, flickering torches, grand staircases. To enter Dracula's castle is to enter the Gothic imagination itself, a place where the boundaries of safety collapse, where the familiar becomes strange. It is a space that promises both danger and revelation. We return not only for Dracula himself, but for the atmosphere that surrounds him, the architecture of dread that his castle embodies. The endurance of Dracula also reflects the way we use him to talk about ourselves. He is the other, but he is also the mirror. Every time we tell his story, we are also telling the story of our fears. Fears of sexuality, of disease, of foreigners, of power, of death. In this sense, Dracula is less a fixed character than a cultural process, a way of externalizing what we cannot confront directly. When syphilis haunted the 19th century, he became a metaphor for infection. When immigration stirred anxieties, he became the foreign invader. When capitalism or communism threatened stability, he became the parasite feeding on society. When AIDS reshaped the 20th century, the vampire myth resurfaced with new urgency. When consumerism defined the modern era, the vampire became the endless consumer. Each age sees itself in him, and each age cannot resist looking. What keeps him alive then is not simply his horror, but his usefulness. Dracula allows us to speak about what we cannot otherwise name. He lets us stage our fears in a Gothic form, confronting them without fully admitting them. To invite him in is to acknowledge the shadow while pretending it is only a story. His immortality is guaranteed because our fears and desires are immortal. They may change form, but they never disappear, and so neither does he. At the same time, Dracula endures because he is entertaining. He is terrifying, but he is also fun. His cape, his accent, his castle, all are theatrical, lending themselves to parody, costume, and play. Children learn to count with Count von Count. Audiences laugh at comedic versions even as they fear darker ones. He is versatile enough to belong in horror films, operas, musicals, cartoons, and Halloween decorations. Few monsters can move so easily between terror and comedy, tragedy and parody. This versatility ensures that he never fades. Even when one version grows stale, another emerges, keeping him fresh in cultural imagination. To ask why we still enter Dracula's castle is also to ask why we still tell stories at all. We return to myths, not because we believe in them literally, but because they give shape to the things we cannot let go of. Dracula is not only a vampire, but a story about power, desire, death, and survival. Each time we step into his castle, we are stepping into that story again, rehearsing its lessons, testing its boundaries, finding new ways to imagine the same fears. His castle is eternal because the human condition is eternal, and he waits within because he is one of the best expressions we have ever created of what we cannot resolve. And so, we keep opening the door. We keep hearing the wolves in the distance, the creak of hinges, the whisper of a voice with a foreign accent. We know what waits inside, the shadow, the hunger, the bite. But we enter anyway, because Dracula is not only a predator, he is also an invitation to fear, to desire, to the Gothic imagination itself. His story is the story of us, and as long as we continue to wrestle with death, with desire, with the outsider and the shadow, we will continue to walk into his castle again and again, never fully free, never fully finished.